The girl started screaming because she suddenly found herself on a desert island, completely unable to understand how this had happened. She had a hard time coming to terms with this because she had no idea where exactly she was or why there was no one around. It all started when she found a discarded novella on the street that she would not have paid attention to before. She got engrossed in reading it and ended up getting hit by a car without even realizing how it happened. The book began with the main character being a great saint, and next to her were 5 male characters. The author described in vivid detail how they survived for a whole year on this patch of land, imbued with magic. This novella, among other things, was filled to the brim with very hot romantic scenes. Simply put, it had an 18+ rating, so it generated a lot of interest among readers. But the worst thing was that she was not reborn as the main character. She possessed Margaret, who was a villain. Margaret Rose Floan, the second daughter of the Duke of Floan. She was so jealous of the main character, who attracted the attention of all the male characters, that she pushed her off a cliff, wanting to kill her. As a result, Margaret turned everyone else against herself, finally losing support. And in the end, she was brutally murdered by the main male character, who by the middle of the story had lost his mind. Memories from her past and Margaret's life were completely mixed up. Therefore, it was difficult for her to remember the plot of the novella in its entirety and without gaps. She managed to inhabit the body of the main villain, and therefore she needs to find shelter as soon as possible, until a door appears that will allow everyone to escape from here in a year. She especially needs to avoid the Crown Prince. After all, it was he who hated Margaret more than anyone else and did not hide it. The main male character of the novel was the Prince of the Langrid Empire, Edward Astor Klaus Langrid. So she had absolutely no idea what the hell he was doing here. He looked a little nervous, and Margaret was in serious trouble from the start. The difficulty level of survival just skyrocketed and kept rising. Then she thought that if Edward was here, it meant that everything was happening at the very beginning of the story. Edward opened his eyes and realized that he was lying on a sandy beach, feeling very irritated. She didn't have time to think. The situation was developing too quickly. She tried to run away, but suddenly a man, who appeared out of nowhere, grabbed her by the leg. She, of course, didn't expect this, so she lost her balance and fell. He was even able to remember her name, and as she already knew, this man was very cruel. He asked Margaret where exactly she was trying to escape to in such a hurry. He looked extremely angry and grabbed her face roughly, not hiding his irritation. He ordered her to quickly explain where she was going to run away to. He seemed to have gotten it all wrong and decided that she was the one who kidnapped him. So she decided to go with plan B and pointed to the side, asking what was there. He said it was nonsense because there was nothing there. But at that moment, the girl was able to escape from his hands. But he managed to grab her again quite quickly and sharply, not allowing her to run far. He asked if she really thought he was going to joke around with her. Therefore, he ordered to immediately tell what was happening. But the girl tried to explain that she herself did not understand anything. He didn't want to believe her and thought she was just lying, trying to get out of it. After everything she had allegedly done to him, she shouldn't have even hoped for his trust. To be honest, he actually had a good reason for this and staying on guard all the time. In the past, Margaret was widely and infamously known for following Edward everywhere, acting like a deranged stalker. To top it all off, one day she bought a potion that turned out to be a mixture to which Edward was terribly allergic, and then he was literally on the verge of death. After that incident, the Crown Prince hated Margaret with all his heart and no longer felt anything for her except contempt. Her list of crimes was impressive enough to land her behind bars at any moment with no chance of acquittal. But thanks to the enormous influence of the Duke, her father, Margaret always managed to get away with it and avoid punishment. The fact that Edward was born to a commoner servant also played a role, which lowered his position at court. Margaret, however, was not ashamed and declared that he had completely misunderstood everything and drawn the wrong conclusions. Her family was indeed powerful, but why would she kidnap the Empire's crown prince if it seemed completely absurd? He noted that this did make sense, which meant that Rodvan's allies could have been involved. Rodvan was the same excommunicated former crown prince whose title Edward now held. Perhaps there really were no political reasons for this, and everything was much simpler. But she would think about all this later, and now she needed to understand how to provide herself with everything she needed to survive. She stated that the interrogation was, in principle, over, and therefore she was going to leave. She also made it clear to him that he shouldn't cling to her as she really wanted to leave. But he noted that if he let her go now, she would run away again, and he could not allow that. After this, Margaret decided to tell him that he was hurting her and was being too rough. He believed that she was simply exaggerating and did not see the real danger of the situation. First, they needed to figure out where exactly they were, find a high place, and survey the surrounding area from there. If they are on the mainland, they will not see the horizon. But if it is an island, the horizon line will be visible. The sun was already setting, and the story said that with the sunset, the island becomes even more dangerous, because this place was enchanted, and it is at the beginning of the night that creepy and aggressive monsters awaken here. Therefore, any action had to be taken only in daylight, and she suggested climbing the mountain tomorrow, since it would be extremely dangerous if sunset caught them on the way. He noted that he hadn't even suspected that she was capable of reasoning logically, and this sounded more like an insult than a compliment. He also made it clear that he agreed that they would only be able to go up there tomorrow. Therefore, now it was worth examining the surroundings and trying to find at least some kind of shelter. He thought quickly and made smart decisions, and it was obvious he had spent a lot of time on the battlefield. The distinguished heir, who had paved his way to the throne through his own efforts, found himself on a desert island and was slowly driven mad by the presence of the main character. But in the novella, it was mentioned that many objects from her reality were kept on the island. The world of this survival book was quite unusual and was an unconventional adventure novel about a desert island where familiar and essential survival items were hidden everywhere. But the heroes of the novel did not understand how to use them, and therefore simply threw them away. What was going on in the mind of the author who wrote all this remained completely unclear. But, unlike the others, she can easily find a use for such items. She should have found the hut mentioned in the book and tried to hide in it. But he made it clear that she was not to even think about making plans to escape again, and she immediately felt awkward. It's better to deal with one person who hates her than with a whole crowd of other heroes who have similar feelings for her. But suddenly, he announced that he had found something useful. He swung his stick through the air with all his might, causing dry leaves to fly in all directions. Apparently, he imagined something, and this stick would be quite suitable as a weapon for the time being. But overall, it was no different from the previously found branches. He made it clear to her that she should not stand there like a pillar as they continued to explore the area. Things were looking bad, as the sun would soon set completely. At the end of the beach, they came across a high cliff, so they had to turn towards the forest. But one couldn't go there after sunset, and she remembered that very well. So she suggested that perhaps they should return to where they came to their senses. And immediately after these thoughts, they heard a loud and drawn-out roar from the depths of the forest. Then she realized it was just a wolf howl, but that didn't make her fear any less. She couldn't believe that they could actually die right now. After all, according to the plot, the monsters were supposed to appear only at night, but now it was still evening. Therefore, she did not understand why they could attack now, violating the logic of the novel. The girl was very scared and jumped back sharply, feeling fear grip her body. But suddenly, Edward grabbed her and covered her with his body, standing between her and the danger. He dealt with this wolf very deftly, acting quickly and without unnecessary movements. Margaret was shocked. He killed the wolf with one blow, simply with a stick and without hesitation. This is the strength of the main male character of the novella, which was previously only read about on the pages. But Edward seemed to have some traumas from the past connected with blood, which she only knew vaguely about. So, looking at him, she was a little surprised by his calm and collected manner. He let go of her, and because of this, she couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. Then she realized that she shouldn't have thought about him too much. She had her own problems up to her neck, and they did not give her any peace. But she didn't understand how this could be. The sun hadn't set yet, and the monsters had already appeared. Perhaps what was more important was not the night itself, but other conditions. The problem was the lack of light. The monsters could only move at night, and since darkness was everywhere, they became active at this time of day. It turns out that she had every chance of simply not living to the point where she could find shelter. The gentleman noticed that she was a little worried, so he paid attention to her. Apparently, she still hasn't recovered from the shock she experienced. He thought that noble people did not often find themselves in such situations. So he said that he had noticed such a monster in advance and decided to ask how she was feeling. She asked him again what he was talking about, and he carefully touched her face. He noted that he was asking because she looked like she was about to give up the ghost. Just a minute ago, he pushed her away, and now his behavior has completely changed. He asked if she was okay and continued to hold her face in his hands. Perhaps, when he saw her, he remembered an early comrade in arms from the past. So she said that everything was fine with her, and there was nothing to worry about. He clarified that she understood that she was still under suspicion, and that upon returning to the Empire, she would be thoroughly interrogated, so she should not die without his permission. But Margaret did not understand what interrogations were being discussed, because she was not guilty of anything. He told her to get up quickly because this place was not safe. For some reason, this attitude towards her made her feel a little calmer. After some time, they finally finished their preparations and made a temporary tent. The gentleman motioned to Margaret to come in and sit down on the laid-out leaves. He was polite even to the girl he hated, and she noted his impeccable etiquette. He also warned her to stay as far away from him as possible and not to move closer, as he had no intention of sleeping next to her. The girl began to be cheeky, making it clear that it was mutual and that it was unknown what might come into his head. She accidentally addressed him informally and immediately apologized, explaining that she meant His Highness. But after that, he still lay down next to her, without moving away so much. She felt very cramped and awkward, so she asked him if he wanted a drink. The gentleman replied that if she ever thought of trying to escape again, he would not allow her to do so and would watch her every step. But the girl noted that they hadn't even drunk regular water today. And if they lost consciousness from dehydration, they could die before they even made it home. He said he was warning her for the last time, but when he saw the expression on her face, he couldn't raise his voice at her. She promised that she would return very quickly and would only go away briefly to find something to drink. She said she was going for coconuts, although she didn't really know what kind of fruit it was. It turned out to be a fruit that grows on palm trees, and its juice quenches thirst well and gives strength. She found one that looked ripe and tried to pry it open with whatever she had at hand. Eating overripe fruit can cause diarrhea, which can lead to dehydration much faster. The girl couldn't believe her eyes when she saw him split a coconut with his bare hands. After this, he calmly handed the opened fruit to her. She stuttered for a moment in shock and was unable to collect her thoughts for a moment. She was amazed at his incredible grip and hidden strength. After taking a couple of sips, she said that she had checked the juice and that it was safe to drink. The gentleman just watched how beautiful she looked when she drank coconut water. The Margaret he had been watching closely all day was strikingly different from the girl he had known before. How does the daughter of a rich duke, bathed in luxury from birth, know how to build a hut? And what fruits are best for quenching thirst in the wild? Whether he even knew this man was now a big question. She looked like an angel, and when she suddenly turned to him, he involuntarily felt embarrassed. He turned to my lady and noted that it seemed to him as if there was a completely different person in front of him. Margaret noted that people tend to change over time, especially when they find themselves in an emergency and dangerous situation. She was going to deny everything until the very end. He had already begun to interrogate her as a suspect, and it was worth it for him to find out that she had moved into this body from the earthly world. He wouldn't understand anything and would decide that everything that was happening was her doing. However, he said that he didn't think so. This happens extremely rarely, but judging by the way she behaves, and what decisions does she make in difficult situations? Perhaps there is some sense in her words. He noted that the Lady Margaret he had known before would never have remained calm in such a situation. After this, he decided to go to bed, considering the conversation over. The first interrogation went well, and she was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But she still didn't understand how to fall asleep now, because from such a distance, she could hear Edward's every breath. She didn't understand how she could sleep peacefully next to him, because this creature seemed like an unusual animal. There was a distinct energy emanating from him, similar to that of a monster. But for some reason, he was still unable to summon his aura sword. It is a blade created from a pure flow of energy. It's not surprising, because in the original, it was said that magic and holy power do not work on this island. Being on the island next to Edward, she had almost nothing to worry about, since he possessed enormous strength. He also sighed and noted that he didn't understand why he was telling her all this, since she wouldn't understand anything anyway. He was a real asshole, and something about the whole situation was clearly wrong. He wondered who and for what reason had chosen Margaret and him for this strange test. If she had decided to kidnap His Highness, she certainly would not have chosen the wild nature for this. She would have locked him in some tower, as is usually the case. After these words of hers, he looked angrily in her direction, clearly not approving of such reasoning. Of course, she was only guessing and had no real intention of doing anything like that. She also asked him what he was doing before he came here, and it turned out that he had a lot of paperwork accumulated, so he was just in his office. She asked if he had noticed anything else besides all this suspicious stuff. He remarked that he felt as if she was interrogating him, and she did not deny it. Edward noted that the end of the year, the busiest season of work, was approaching, and as far as he remembered, he had not left the palace for about a month. He was a real workaholic, and then asked what the lady had been doing then. She said that, at the time, she was sitting at home and in complete delight circling around his huge portrait, which she had difficulty reaching. But he didn't need to know about it, so she limited herself to saying that she was simply enjoying her time in one of the salons on their estate. She, too, could not remember the details exactly, although she had communicated with many representatives of high society. He suggested that they finish with these peculiar interrogations and save their strength, as it was time to go to bed. Tomorrow they had to climb the mountain and try to figure out where exactly they were now. She felt very stuffy, which made the gentleman noticeably embarrassed again. He warned that if she started pestering him, he would throw her into the ocean without a second thought. The girl was indignant, mentally noting that she would not have pestered him even if he had begged. Now the crown prince of the empire and the captain of the imperial guard were here, the great saint, the archbishop, and the archmage. And all these people ended up in one place. Since so many influential people had gathered here, it meant that the person behind all this was clearly targeting more than just Edward. The novella said that everyone was supposed to wake up in different places. While Edward and Margaret were sorting things out on the beach, they were unexpectedly bumped into by Juliana, the main character. That is, from the very beginning, the story went completely differently than it should have. And the worst thing was that she never finished reading the book. Since the plot changes, it might not be safe to be in that hut. In that case, they should have found the hut and taken all the useful items from there, and then go in search of the underground shelter that the heroine was supposed to discover next. According to the plot, and closer to the end of the first volume, Juliana, in addition to the hut, finds an underground shelter, but the heroes ignore it and enter the open portal door. Perhaps all of this was just a long dream, and tomorrow she will wake up in her bed. If that happens, she'll be a little sorry that she never got to see Archmage Caden, her favorite character. After some time, she heard rustling in the forest and noticed a fair-haired man there. The next day, Margaret realized that, unfortunately, it was not a dream at all. At night, she felt like she was freezing to death. Now, she decided that every time before falling asleep, she would first make a fire. Turning to the side, she saw Edward's jacket, and he asked in surprise if she was awake. Margaret looked at him in surprise and noticed that he had risen too early. He just looked in her direction silently. Then the lady suggested that perhaps he had not slept at all that night. At least he looked like he hadn't slept a wink. She realized that they didn't know how long they could survive without food, and wasting their energy without restoring it through sleep was dangerous. He doubted whether he could trust her, and this clearly bothered him. But he still covered her with his jacket at night, as if protecting her. Margaret had never met a man whose words and actions were so at odds with each other. After that, her stomach growled loudly, attracting attention. So she suggested that we first eat a coconut to restore our strength, and then continue on our way. When they climbed the mountain and dawn broke, it became clear that this was indeed an uninhabited island. And at that moment, she realized that she was inside a cursed novella with an 18+ rating. Suddenly, Edward hit his fist and screamed that this was a curse, and this island was really damned. He had no idea where they were. Moreover, he didn't understand who had sent them here, and was completely confused. For the first time, Margaret saw Edward so broken and lost. But she herself was not in the best position, and her strength was also leaving her. There was still a whole year left before the doors appeared, and it seemed like an eternity. The question of whether she could survive among men who were slowly going crazy was becoming more and more acute, and she had to run before Edward started to panic. However, she had already spent all her strength to climb here, and fatigue was making itself felt. His condition was deteriorating, and insanity could set in much faster than they expected. She was a former scout camp instructor, and knew how to stay calm in critical situations. And she couldn't allow herself to leave things as they were. The escape could wait. First, she needed to calm Edward down. She extended her hand to him, reminding him that they now knew for sure that this was Polina Island, and suggested that they go down peacefully in order to survive and return home. Edward had a wealth of experience in combat and on the battlefield, which inspired respect, but he had not slept all night and was completely exhausted, which made him vulnerable. Margaret understood that he was now in no condition to think clearly and make decisions. She decided that they should move on. Otherwise, they might run into dangerous creatures. Suddenly, he actually took her hand, and this surprised her greatly. She hadn't expected at all that the man she had previously hated would show such caution. What confused her even more was that he seemed to thank her, and she stood there in confusion. She immediately thought that he might have understood everything wrong, but he turned away as if he hadn't heard anything, and this added to her awkwardness. Her stomach growled again, and Margaret realized she had expended too much energy climbing the mountain. When they went downstairs, Edward was shocked that Margaret was going to fish alone. She explained that she could be relied upon, and even if she failed to catch any fish, she would collect oysters and seaweed. From that moment on, she lifted her dress to make it easier to move, and this caused embarrassment to Edward. Margaret noted that he might be busy making a fire, and she herself did not understand why his behavior was so strange. She was surprised and thought that he should have seen women's legs before, and it shouldn't have caused such embarrassment. But his reaction remained a mystery to her, and she tried to focus on the matter at hand, not on his behavior. She asked if he knew how to light a fire, and he nodded, confirming his skills. Therefore, she ordered him to go and carry out this task immediately, without delay. Margaret herself decided to try to remember her fishing skills from her past life in order to apply them here. The creatures described in the story, in addition to the wolves that attacked them yesterday, seemed quite dangerous. Dangerous snakes and various reptiles lurked in the bushes and on the shore. Otherwise, the island was little different from the real world she was used to. You can't survive for long on coconuts alone. It wasn't enough to survive. To obtain nutritious food, it was necessary to engage in hunting and fishing. She had never fished in the sea before, so she doubted whether she would succeed. She did know how to catch fish with a harpoon, but she had previously only practiced in the river. First, she needed to find a spot where the water flowed in exactly one direction. The first step in spearfishing is to carefully check the crevices between the boulders where the waves break. Small fish that are carried by the waves into these cracks get stuck and cannot emerge. The second step is to crush the small fish with a stone to use it as bait for larger specimens. After this, you can move on to using the harpoon to catch large fish. It will take patience to freeze and wait for suitable prey without unnecessary movements. Suddenly, the girl realized that she needed to act immediately, without wasting time. And with a sharp movement, she used the harpoon, directing it precisely at the target. A moment later, her eyes lit up, and she saw a fish caught in the crack. Margaret realized that she could cope with this on her own, without outside help. She simply couldn't believe that she got it right the first time, which made her incredibly happy. While living in Korea, she realized that she loved challenging hikes, but she didn't think much about it at the time. Now she felt that she was made to survive in the wild, although she herself did not understand why this made her so happy. Meanwhile, there was a gentleman standing behind whose hands the firewood suddenly fell out. Margaret turned around and he was simply shocked, not knowing where to look. She wondered how long he had been standing there, and this made her a little embarrassed. She decided to pretend she hadn't noticed him and continued to concentrate on fishing. After some time, the gentleman prepared the vatra himself, admitting that he was impressed by her skills. He didn't even think that she could catch fish and cut it up so skillfully. Margaret believed that any fisherman could do this, and even made a knife, carved from wood. Then she remembered that in the original, the main character ate the food that Edward caught for her. But here she completely entered into hunter mode and dealt with everything herself, without relying on him. She was doing what Edward usually did, and it felt both unusual and pleasant at the same time. Even though she was the one who suggested it first, she still felt some discomfort inside. He noticed her displeased look and thought that something had happened, although she did not show it. But the lady simply turned away, saying that nothing special had happened, hiding her emotions. After that, he came very close, and Margaret again felt embarrassed and slightly nervous. He looked her straight in the eyes, and the lady felt her embarrassment increase many times over. He noted that she was easily frightened, and this amusingly surprised him. After that, he gently stroked her head, trying to calm her down and reduce the tension. Today, he watched her out of curiosity, trying to understand her behavior and reactions. Margaret became even more embarrassed, and he noted that from tomorrow on, he would take over the fishing himself, relieving her of some of the burden. These words made the woman even more embarrassed and feel slightly confused. She almost succumbed to his charm. It was impossible to remain calm in the face of such closeness and such a beautiful face. Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest, and she had to pull herself together to keep from losing control. Sitting next to him, the girl realized that hidden feelings were already beginning to emerge between them that were difficult to ignore. She handed him a large fish, realizing that he needed more energy to restore his strength. She added that there was no Langrid Empire here, and he could not relax and feel completely safe. But the guy replied that she didn't have to bother because he understood the situation perfectly well and was ready to act himself. He suggested that she try it herself first, and then they could eat it together, sharing the effort. He said that he understood how scared the girl was, finding herself in this strange and alien place, and promised to do everything so that she could get out of there. The girl listened to his words, thinking about what was happening, trying to understand why the guy could not grasp her thoughts and feelings. The young man himself seemed to be stepping on her throat with his words, creating contradictions between his promises and actions. Although she had read enough to understand what was happening on the island, she didn't even know if anyone had survived the incident. Suddenly, the young man jumped up abruptly. His abrupt movements confused the girl. She tried to understand what caused such a reaction. The lady looked at him attentively, not understanding the essence of his words, and he, noticing her bewilderment, expressed distrust of her assumptions. He explained that he would leave her only if he decided to do so himself, emphasizing his power over the situation. Hearing this, the girl was stunned. Her gaze met the guy's confidence, which left no doubt about the seriousness of his words. He added that she should remember this forever, to which the young lady nodded and promised to remember his instruction. Goosebumps ran across her skin, because anyone who heard these words without context would immediately think that the guy was possessed. She couldn't understand why His Highness was heading to a certain place, leaving her in the dark. He advised the girl to wrap up warmer, but he himself remained mysterious, and she simply looked at him, trying to grasp the meaning. The Duke explained that he gave her the jacket only because he himself felt the heat, without expecting gratitude. He also added that there was no need to thank him, since it was completely natural, which caused the girl slight irritation. She still knew there was some truth in his words. Sitting with the fish in her hands, she doubted whether Edward's attitude towards Margaret had changed in just one day. Suddenly, a slight smile appeared on her face, because now she knew that she would not freeze at night, and this brought some relief. The Duke entered the tent and immediately noticed a strange scene that attracted his attention in an unusual way. The girl seemed to have slept poorly, and it was clear that she was cold. Her body was shaking from fatigue and tension. It's strange, because the jacket was given to her for warmth, but she didn't use it properly and didn't want to disturb the Duke. Suddenly, he heard a voice speaking to him with irritation. The words seemed harsh, and he asked again, trying to understand the meaning. It turned out that the girl was shouting at someone, clearly expressing strong dissatisfaction and swearing, which surprised the Duke. He tried to comprehend what was happening, listening to the screams, but he had difficulty understanding what exactly was being discussed. It was not yet entirely clear who she was talking to, and this added to the confusion in his perception of what was happening. Suddenly, she grabbed his jacket, and the fabric stretched, causing him slight surprise and bewilderment. This amused him slightly, but he still didn't fully understand what had happened, so he simply covered her more tightly with his jacket without explaining. She turned out to be not so simple, and even a little strange, but this made her image more interesting and mysterious for the Duke. After that, a new day arrived, bringing with it a feeling of freshness and new challenges for both of them. Sleeping on the sand for 2 days clearly hadn't done her any good. Her body felt stiff. Her muscles seemed to be numb from discomfort. The Duke came up from behind and noted that her beloved had done a good job, praising the work done with respect. Because of this, the girl became very scared and asked what they were talking about, her eyes expressing surprise and slight fear. He asked her if she had forgotten what she had said yesterday, when she had expressed her emotions very vividly and called him obscene words. Continuing the conversation, he recalled how she had cried and hugged her jacket yesterday, emphasizing the emotional tension of what was happening. He noticed that, among other things, she swore like a drunken sailor, and this frightened the lady, making her very nervous and confused. At that moment, she realized that what was happening was not a dream at all, and she was completely confused, not understanding what he meant. Edward noted that she was only pretending to be a saint and innocent, although her background and upbringing made her capable of harsh words and daring actions. It seemed that all this could have been a dream, but he was not ready to agree with such a thought, leaving doubts in his head. He said that if she was so ashamed of what happened, he would pretend that he had not heard anything, so as not to complicate the situation. Besides, she was always a lady with slightly strange habits, which gave her behavior a special unpredictability. After this, he turned around, calmly noting that he was not particularly surprised, since much of it was predictable. She felt that there was hidden mockery in his words, especially when he called her a weirdo, which slightly hurt her pride. He added that he would henceforth support her interests and protect her position, as if carefully covering up her weaknesses. The lady became very embarrassed, blushing, and tried to explain that he had understood everything incorrectly and had misinterpreted her actions. Over time, she handed him the jacket and was grateful that he had kindly lent her the item at the right time. Edward looked at her with a slight question and said that in his place, anyone would have done the same thing, without hesitation. He also noted that if she needed help, she could immediately contact him because he was ready to support her in any situation. He said that he would be happy to help her in any difficulties, and she could fully rely on his support and strength. Margaret said that in this situation, she is thinking about how best to ensure survival in the difficult conditions of the island. To do this, they will have to go to another island where conditions may be more suitable and safe for both of them. He said that they should first leave some kind of sign for anyone who might be looking for them, so that they don't get lost or trapped. If they go into the forest, their chances of survival will increase significantly, as there will be more shelter and opportunities to hide. But finding help in these places would be difficult, and his words made sense in warning of potential difficulties. They would not be able to leave this island until the door that could become the only exit opened. If she tells Edward everything, it will only increase his suspicions and complicate their mutual understanding and trust. Now, there is practically no choice, and they will have to act independently, taking full control of the situation. She said she felt it was right to split up to increase her chances of survival and success in finding a way out. Hearing this, he felt real horror, realizing that such a plan could be dangerous and required special care. She added that she was sincerely grateful to him for saving the monster, showing care and attention to someone else's life. She enjoyed working with him, even though their time together was rather short, but memorable. She said goodbye, but he grabbed her shoulder sharply, making her stop and realize that it wasn't over yet. He reminded her that he had warned her yesterday and that she should act only when he gave her permission so that everything would be safe. The lady said that she remembered these words, but now their paths had diverged, and everyone must go their own way, following their own decisions. This decision was logical, and he should have realized for himself that separation for the sake of safety and survival was necessary. The threat of monsters has not gone away, which means you need to find shelter in the forest before sunset to stay alive. If they continue to remain on the beach, they risk missing the door's appearance, which will ruin their chances of escaping the island's trap. She needed to find a safe haven or cabin to both uncover the island's secret and understand why she ended up in Margaret's body. The gentleman looked closely at Margaret and expressed interest in why she considered such a dangerous decision logical and justified. Margaret suddenly came closer to him, her gaze hard, and she noted that he was only saying this because he was concerned for their safety. He was genuinely worried that the girl might get into trouble, although, in reality, the danger was not as real as it seemed to him at first. His main goal was to keep Margaret under surveillance, as his trust in her was high, but caution remained an important part of his plans. Margaret decided to explain that she was stronger than she seemed at first glance, and reminded him that he had already seen how she was able to cope with difficulties. The gentleman, after listening to her, confirmed that they would still go together, not leaving her alone on this dangerous path, and this decision was final. He planned to walk alongside her while continuing to look for ways to send a distress signal to increase the chances of being rescued from the island. The main idea was clear. He wanted to get off this island with her, sharing the dangers and caring for Margaret's safety. Incredibly, he himself made the decision to go with her, overcoming his own resistance and the doubts that were accumulating in his soul. Perhaps during these days, his former hostility towards Margaret had eased a little, and his emotions had begun to change, leaving room for respect and cautious sympathy. Margaret considered this an excellent decision, since a joint path increased her chances of success and gave her the opportunity to demonstrate her skills. If she can win Edward's trust, her own future could also change dramatically, opening up new opportunities and paths. Margaret calmly pointed her finger to the side, drawing attention to a certain place where shelter or a safe path could be found. The gentleman focused on her gesture, and she noted that there was a cave visible in the rock that could be a reliable shelter option. The road to the cave was difficult and required caution, but it remained the safest and most sensible option among all the others. He speculated that her skills and endurance were acquired through her upbringing in the Floan family, where she was prepared for difficult challenges. Margaret didn't even know how to react to such an assumption because her training and experience were much broader and deeper than he thought. So she decided to first tell him about her comprehensive education, without revealing all the details right away, and then deal with his reaction. She didn't see the point in informing him about everything completely, preferring to keep some of the information to herself, leaving an element of surprise. The gentleman remarked that it turned out that the Duke, her father, really valued her very much, and it was surprising that she had to undergo such strict and cruel training. He admitted that he had underestimated her abilities, and now realized that her skills were much stronger than he had originally thought. Margaret didn't understand why he suddenly became so serious, but she noted that now all her skills were put to good use, and that was important. It can be said that all the training was not in vain, and now it is even more important to hurry, because it will start raining soon, and they need to act faster. If they hesitate and wait, they risk getting stuck in the mud, making movement virtually impossible and increasing the danger for both of them. At that moment, Margaret caught on a branch and did not immediately understand how it happened. Feeling a sharp loss of balance and sudden fear, having hit herself very painfully, she realized that the damned dress had caught on a branch, and this had caused her to fall, adding to the troubles on the way. He immediately rushed to her side to make sure she was okay, checking her condition and readiness to continue on her way. The gentleman extended his hand to her, asking if she could get up on her own, trying to assess the extent of her injury and her ability to move. Margaret rose, but her leg was injured, and she tried to hold on despite the pain and discomfort that prevented her from walking freely. She admitted that her leg hurt, but tried not to show weakness, realizing that every minute was important on the way to safety. Edward suggested that she sit down on a branch to catch her breath and ease the pain a little, giving her time to regain her strength before continuing on her way. He watched her, and Margaret felt a slight tickle from his attention, which caused her mixed feelings, but she tried to concentrate. He noticed that he now understood why she moved so slowly and appreciated her efforts, acknowledging that the movement was not easy for her. Realizing this, he asked her forgiveness for not taking her condition into account, admitting his mistakes and demonstrating concern for her safety. He decided to take her in his arms to carry her further, making her journey easier and preventing further injuries, showing care and determination at the same time. This left Margaret very confused, not knowing how to properly respond to his unexpected concern and such a direct, albeit helpful, act. She asked what he was doing and tried to free herself, kicking slightly, not used to such close and decisive help from Edward. He simply noted that it was better to get to the cave as quickly as possible before it started raining, and that was the most important thing at this stage of the journey. This was, of course, true, but he also added that he would quicken his pace, and if she did not want to fall, she must hold on tighter than ever before so as not to lose her balance. Margaret felt a slight shyness, and this made her involuntarily press closer to him, feeling his confidence and warmth, which gave at least a little peace. However, such closeness turned out to be almost excessive. Clouds began to thicken above their heads, creating a tense atmosphere, as if nature itself was warning of impending danger. Suddenly, they noticed a raven flying low above them. Margaret thought it might be related to Edward, who turned out to be the novella's protagonist and was attracting strange events. She felt significantly calmer around him. His presence gave her a sense of protection that helped keep her anxiety under control and eased some of the internal tension. Now he had warmed up a little towards her in his behavior, and all that remained was to hope that the appearance of the main character would not change their relationship, because this was a unique chance to strengthen the trust between them. Margaret, gathering her courage, turned to him mentally, acknowledging that he had observed quite correctly. Since the moment she appeared on the island, she had really changed and become a different person. So she allowed him to believe that in some sense she had been reborn, as if old habits and fears had been left behind, leaving room for a new outlook on herself and on life. She made a promise that she would not repeat her past mistakes and would not treat him the way she had before, which could become the basis for future friendship and mutual understanding. Edward didn't even immediately know how to react to her confession. Margaret assumed that he internally considered it wrong and doubted the sincerity of his reaction to her words. But suddenly he said that he actually felt almost no disgust when communicating with her, which was unexpected and a little encouraging for Margaret, making her heart beat faster. At the same time, he emphasized that even she should not expect any romantic feelings from him, leaving clear boundaries and cold control between them. Now, he simply behaved towards her as befits a gentleman, showing courtesy and respect, but giving no reason to hope for anything more, which left Margaret with inner confusion. Therefore, he advised her not to have any illusions or false expectations, as this would only complicate their relationship and could lead to unnecessary emotional pain for both parties. Any hope could only complicate the situation and add strain to the relationship. Margaret realized she had to be careful not to create unnecessary problems and misunderstandings for herself and him. At that moment, the girl realized that her words were practically useless, and any attempts to explain or change the situation would not help if he was determined to remain cold and reserved. Suddenly they heard quiet, almost imperceptible footsteps coming from all directions, giving the impression that they were being watched and prepared for a surprise attack. However, the sun had not yet set, and Margaret could not believe that the monsters had already appeared. Her mind tried to find an explanation, but fear and anxiety grew with every second. At some point, Edward accidentally pushed her to the ground, warning her that she needed to defend herself, because now it was everyone for themselves, and the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. He said that he would deal with the monsters himself, but his words sounded both confident and alarming, because the number of enemies seemed insurmountable and threatening right here, nearby. However, the monsters had already managed to surround Margaret, creating a ring of threat that was tightening with every second, and she felt that she needed to act quickly, otherwise there would be no chance of survival. Despite the danger, the lady remained calm. Her face remained confident. She looked focused and prepared for any outcome, trying to keep her emotions under control. In this situation, Edward did not know what to do. His resolve clashed with uncertainty, and his desire to protect her fought with the danger posed by the creatures surrounding them. Of course, fear was inevitable, and Margaret didn't know how to proceed. Every move could be her last, and tension hung in the air like an invisible threat. But she managed to shout for Edward not to stand motionless like a pillar, but to act, because passivity in such a situation could cost his life, and every moment counted. He held one monster in his arms, screaming at her to run, showing incredible strength and determination that inspired respect and a sudden sense of security. The girl didn't even have time to react quickly to what was happening. Her movements were slowed by fear and surprise, but her survival instinct demanded immediate action. She knew she had to survive, so she tried to get up and somehow distance herself from the danger, trying to find a way to escape despite the obstacles. Her dress was in the way, creating additional difficulties, but Margaret had no intention of becoming a hindrance to Edward. She knew that her movements had to be quick and precise. She needed to climb the nearest tree, but suddenly one of the monsters grabbed her hand, which made her heart stop and added a feeling of hopelessness to this dangerous situation. She began to scream, but it was not from fear of death. On the contrary, she felt a strange excitement and readiness to fight, realizing that now every moment was worth its weight in gold. Meanwhile, Edward had already driven off the remaining monsters and was running towards her. His decisive movements demonstrated incredible speed and strength that could have saved Margaret at that moment. The memory of the lady's words about how one shouldn't be so stubborn surfaced in his mind, and how she had told Edward that she completely didn't understand his motives. These memories added tension and emotion to the events. Margaret still didn't understand why he didn't want to marry her or propose. Her thoughts were confused, because logic and feelings didn't coincide, creating an internal dilemma. She seemed to have everything a highness could desire: pedigree, wealth, the status of heiress, but something was still missing, and this feeling remained painfully palpable. She often said rather harsh things to him, which sometimes caused pain and exacerbated their conflicts. These words, spoken in the past, left a mark and complicated the relationship between them. It is therefore not surprising that Edward felt strong irritation and even hatred towards Margaret. Past grievances and misunderstandings created a barrier that was difficult to overcome. Although he could partially soften his hatred, it was impossible to completely rid himself of negative emotions. The past remained a shadow over their communication. There was no hope of warm feelings on his part. The line between respect and emotional closeness remained strictly defined, and Margaret was clearly aware of this. Her only chance of survival was an underground bunker where she could hide from the monsters and temporarily rest until the situation became safer and more controlled. And yet, she wanted to believe that during the time of danger they had experienced, at least a small closeness had developed between them and Edward, which allowed them to feel support and trust. When Margaret opened her eyes, she was surprised to still be alive. This feeling of relief was mixed with anxiety about what could happen at any moment. She was prepared for the fact that she could end her life in the stomach of a monster. But, to her surprise, survival turned out to be real, and this made her rethink her own possibilities. She didn't understand how it had happened, but she saw a pool of blood in front of her and realized that someone had been hurt in the battle. This moment made her heart beat faster with horror and anxiety. There were also bodies of monsters lying in front of her, and Margaret began to wonder what was going on with Edward. Her anxiety for him grew stronger because she realized that he could have been injured. She looked towards him and saw that he was standing with his back to her, tense and focused, which added confidence that he had managed to cope with the danger. Thank God, it was him, and apparently it was Edward who saved her. This realization instilled a feeling of gratitude and relief that slightly calmed the inner fear. She turned to him mentally, trying to understand if he was all right, assessing his condition and readiness to continue the fight or protect them both in the event of a new threat. But he noticed that his hands were covered in blood, and this reminded Margaret of something important. Memories of past events washed over her, causing anxiety and a sense of danger. She remembered that his past traumas were connected to the fact that the sight of human blood made Edward fly into a rage, and this knowledge made the situation even more tense and unpredictable. In this state, he is capable of surpassing the limits of normal physical strength, and Margaret understood that until he is exhausted to the point of fainting, his capabilities are practically limitless and dangerous to those around him. Margaret knew she had to act quickly. If she delayed, the target of all the dangers would shift to her, and the consequences would be fatal. She turned to Edward with a request for forgiveness, realizing that only a peaceful step could at least slightly calm his anger and maintain control of the situation. Edward immediately turned his attention to her, and Margaret took advantage of the moment to stun him, using the surprise that gave her a chance to escape. A moment later, the Crown Prince was already lying on the ground, powerless and confused, and around them there was only silence, broken by the noise of the wind and the sounds of the forest. Margaret understood that if Edward regained consciousness in this state, he would certainly become a threat to her, and this could turn into a tragedy. She tried to lift him onto her back and drag him to safety, but the weight and the injury made it an incredibly difficult test, even for her strength and endurance. Her head was in complete disarray. She couldn't understand how she had ended up in this place, and how she had dealt with the previous difficulties that had led her here. With great effort, Margaret pulled him out of the forest and into the safety of a cave, where they could at least catch their breath and assess his condition without unnecessary danger. And then she noticed that his wounds were much more serious than she expected. And now every step she took required the utmost caution and concentration. There were growls and hisses all around, and the fangs and claws of the forest monsters showed that an encounter with them could be fatal, and some of them could be poisonous. Margaret decided to tear off a piece of her dress to make a temporary bandage on the wound and stop the bleeding, realizing that every minute of delay was life-threatening. There was no time for long deliberation. It was necessary to act quickly and provide first aid that could save Edward before it was too late. Now, all that was left was to hope that the wound had not become infected, as the slightest contamination could have turned the situation into a mortal threat for the prince. Margaret also noticed a familiar plant growing in the cave. She realized that it could be useful for healing and preventing infection of the wound. She looked closely at the plant and instantly realized that worse consequences could occur if its properties were not used in a timely and correct manner. Now, all that remained was to wait for Edward to come to his senses. But if he remained in a state of rage, she would be in mortal danger, and no plan would work. Margaret looked at the rope and immediately thought about how best to use it to keep the prince and herself safe without causing unnecessary harm. She decided to tie him up just in case, to prevent any sudden movements and minimize the risk until his condition and intentions were determined. After some time, Edward opened his eyes, but did not understand where he was or why he was tied up. Rage and confusion completely took over his mind. He was confused, not understanding what was happening, and the rage inside him was growing, turning the situation into a dangerous moment for both sides. Margaret noticed that he was gradually coming to his senses, and this gave him a chance to control it if he acted carefully and directed his emotions correctly. She watched him, trying to understand how he was feeling, and tried to assess his condition without unnecessary stress and danger to herself. Edward immediately expressed his incomprehension and rage with a cry, not understanding why he was tied up and who allowed her to do this. Filling with fear and irritation, he demanded to be released from the rope immediately, trying to suppress the feelings of confusion and anger that made the situation extremely tense. He seemed to still be in a state of rage, so Margaret decided to explain with her gesture that he needed to remain calm for his own safety. If he moved too much, The wounds might open up and cause blood loss. But he tried to break the rope, not realizing that it was life-threatening. He couldn't understand what was happening, but Margaret pointed to his mouth and gestured for him to be silent, trying to control the situation without words so as not to provoke another outburst of rage. She made it clear that resistance must be stopped immediately in order to preserve the prince's health and life, showing that it was in his own interests. He had to remain calm because her actions were for his benefit, even if he didn't realize it yet and felt dissatisfied. Edward was confused, not understanding why Margaret was behaving so strangely and unusually, although her intentions remained kind and cautious. Margaret noticed that he finally listened to her instructions, although it caused him a slight embarrassment and uncertainty, which she had not expected at all. She had certainly never seen such a development of events in her previous observations, and the situation remained tense, requiring the utmost attention and caution. At this moment, everything was relatively calm, but Edouard did not understand why his body stopped obeying his own commands, which added chaos to what was happening. Margaret stroked his head, a calming gesture, showing that everything would be okay and trying to regain control of the situation without further ado. He looked at her and her smile looked incredibly sweet, as if the world had stopped for a moment, and this small happiness lit up everything around. He closed his eyes and lay down next to her, feeling her presence gradually soothe the anxiety and tension that had lingered throughout the day. He closed his eyes again, trying to fall asleep, although his thoughts were confused and anxiety did not leave him, preventing him from forgetting for even a minute and finding peace in the silence. Thank God, the internal tension began to subside, and he felt relief, as if a heavy burden had suddenly disappeared from his shoulders, leaving behind lightness and peace. If it hadn't worked, the consequences would have been dire. She could have ended up like the wolves in the forest, with no chance of escape, completely under their control. In the new scene, Edward became enraged at the sight of blood, his eyes filled with wild apprehension, and his inner anger threatened to burst out like an uncontrollable storm. Then Juliana calmed him down gently and confidently, and he gradually came to his senses, allowing his emotions to subside. Otherwise, the situation could have ended very badly for everyone. The mayor didn't even want to think about it. It was too difficult to accept the fact of violence and anxiety that hung over everything like dark clouds over the city. But after this incident, their relationship began to develop, slowly and carefully, breaking through mistrust and fear, creating new connections between them. For Juliana, everything that was happening was a romantic adventure, full of excitement and trepidation. But for Margaret, it remained a harsh game of survival, where every step could cost dearly. After some time, the rain finally stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the earth with bright rays and giving the surrounding world peace and warmth. The water collected in a coconut shell, which became a temporary replacement for regular water, and Margaret used it to help Edward, trying to ease his suffering. Edouard was slowly coming to his senses, but the night of torment from the earth's heat had left its mark. Weakness, trembling, and a feeling of fatigue that could not be easily driven away. She decided to bring him this water, realizing that every sip could restore his strength, and that her actions could play a decisive role in his recovery. However, she was surprised when she approached him, not understanding what exactly was happening to him and why his condition had changed so much in a short time. He must have been so thirsty, every cell in his body was thirsty for moisture, and the feeling was unbearable, as if life itself was leaving him. She watched him carefully as he sat with the water, watching him taste it carefully, trying to find relief in each sip. At least he had come to his senses, and that was already a huge weight off her shoulders, allowing her to feel that some of her worries and anxieties had become unnecessary. But it was impossible to leave things as they were. If nothing was done, he would get worse again, and she understood that she needed to collect medicinal herbs to help him fully recover. So she decided to go get herbs and other remedies to care for his wounds, as well as food, knowing that it was critical to his life and health. She told herself that she would be back soon, and this gave her at least some sense of confidence that her actions would not be in vain, and that Edward would not be left alone in pain. Edward silently looked at the water in the coconut, feeling every drop as salvation, although words and thoughts were stuck inside, and he could not yet express gratitude or relief. He was suffering from thirst, feeling excruciatingly dry and weak. Every second was hard, and without Margaret's help, he would hardly have been able to endure this nightmare. She could have at least untied his hands so he could drink on his own, but she left him like that, watching as he slowly came to his senses and learned to use the water carefully. Meanwhile, Margaret was looking for herbs, but most of the plants around were not suitable, and this added to the difficulty, forcing her to carefully select every leaf and root. Then she finally found an herb that could help with bleeding, and decided to take a small portion, realizing that it was enough to treat Edward. She needed to get back before dark, but suddenly she felt a strange feeling, as if someone was watching her, and her steps slowed with unexpected tension. She heard someone's footsteps ahead, distinct and rhythmic, and her heart began to beat faster, because on this island, any approach of a stranger could be dangerous. She thought it might be a monster again, but the sun was high and monsters couldn't appear here, which made her wonder who was coming towards her. It was most likely a person, and she turned around, looking to the side, trying to make out the figure and assess the potential danger that could lie in wait for her. If there was a man ahead, the problems could be even more serious, because there were currently 5 men on the island, including Edward and the main character, which made the situation tense. And Mark, who was nearby, complicated the situation. Feeding Edward was difficult, and caring for another person seemed an almost impossible task for Juliana. So she didn't agree with it, but still found herself in the hands of the blonde, realizing that she had no choice, and she had to act carefully so as not to harm herself and others. He made it clear that he was not alone here, and Margaret did not know how to react, because the appearance of a new person could completely change the course of events and her plans on the island. Silver hair, red eyes, and a serious expression made his appearance even more alarming and mysterious, adding tension to her thoughts and actions. She didn't understand why Caden was there, because his appearance seemed completely inopportune and could ruin the entire cautious strategy she had been following. It was a very bad time, and she tried to escape, realizing that a delay or a mistake could cost her dearly. Because on the island, survival depended on every decision and step. Of all the possible options, Margaret encountered the character she tried to avoid at all costs, knowing that meeting him would be dangerous. In the original, Edward was the one who showed the most hostility towards her, hated Margaret more than anyone else, and his gaze was always full of hostility. But the real threat to her remained Caden, whose strength and experience made him the most dangerous of all who could harm her. After all, it was his hand that once became the cause of her death at a decisive moment, leaving a deep trace of fear in her memory. Caden Black Rawhide was the second son of a noble family, his lineage placing a heavy burden of expectations and responsibility on him. When he was a child, the church's servants either kidnapped him or performed cruel experiments on him, leaving an indelible mark. Around this time, the Marquis, his father, made an important agreement with the temple, the details of which were hidden from outsiders. It was as if everyone had forgotten what had happened, and it was because of this childhood trauma that Caden harbored an implacable hatred for the temple and his own family. He hid his anger, but sabotaged any magical experiments conducted by the temple and funded by his family clan. Any experience that could strengthen the family's influence through magic, Caden stubbornly closed off and prevented, considering it his duty. At first glance, it seemed like nothing to do with Margaret, but one day, she approached the temple with an unusual request. Her goal was to create a powerful love potion, a move that left those watching the process baffled. The main character considered Margaret a simple fool, not realizing that there was hidden potential and a certain courage in her actions. Caden caught up with her and tried to stop her, but his intervention was untimely, and the conflict only escalated. Once they arrived at her family's duchy, the situation escalated to the point of confrontation, and a clash became inevitable. In an attempt to hold her hands, they fell to the ground together, and the tension between them noticeably increased at that moment. Margaret ignored his requests and continued working on the potion, demonstrating her tenacity and independence. It was this incident that caused her to dislike Caden, hardening his inner hostility and suspicion. And right now, they are lying face to face on the ground, and the tension between them is almost physical. As if the air itself is ringing, she demanded that he step away and let her go, trying to regain distance and control of the situation. He asked her to stop twitching, but he accidentally touched her, and this only increased Margaret's confusion and internal tension. He asked if she was okay, but she turned away, hiding her true feelings and reaction to what had happened. Then she noticed that a pendant from Caden's robe had fallen on her, and the object was heavy and unusually massive. Her weight felt like a ton, and the suspension pressed down on her, creating an additional sense of surprise and physical discomfort. After this, Caden gently touched her face, saying that he felt as if they had met before in life. Margaret tried to pretend she didn't know him, hiding any sign of interest or memories of past meetings. He insisted that he could swear he had seen her somewhere before, demonstrating both confidence and persistence. However, he immediately apologized for the accidental collision, noting that it must have been unpleasant, and offered to help her up. He also explained that she needed to understand his position and intentions so that the situation would not seem hostile to her. If he remembered correctly, the consequences of the experiments that were conducted on him as a child left deep trauma and fears. He wandered through the wild forests and accidentally stumbled upon members of high society, which aroused his curiosity and anxiety at the same time. Margaret spoke of a broken stone that allowed mana control, and of an unusual disruption in the magical flow on the island. Due to the disrupted flow of mana, he often suffered from heat and other unpleasant sensations, making him vulnerable and unstable. During the attacks, he completely lost control of himself and no external influences could calm him down without outside help. The only one who could stabilize his condition and regain control was the main character, Juliana. Her presence had a calming effect. He asked why she ended up running away, trying to understand her motives and the reasons that made her avoid direct contact with him. He couldn't fly into a rage like Edward, so she decided to act somehow, carefully adjusting to his unpredictable behavior. He thought what was happening was strange, because he clearly heard her screaming and calling him names, and this did not at all correspond to the idea that she could be a stranger to him. The girl was making a squealing noise, and it made him wonder what was really going on, why she was reacting so strangely to his presence. She raised her head proudly, as if asserting her independence, and clearly expected him to explain what he wanted from her, not hiding her surprise. Her expression caught his attention, and he noted to himself that despite her character, she looked sweet, attractive, almost like a funny riddle. However, she immediately asked to let her go, explaining that he looked alien, strange, as if from another world, and that her peace of mind was important to her. He refused, saying that he did not intend to let her go, since the meeting had already taken place, and now it was impossible for them to simply become friends, or simply get to know each other. The girl didn't understand who told him that she was ready to be friends, and this made him wonder why the feeling of familiarity with her did not leave him alone. Suddenly, the realization came to him. He really did know her from somewhere, and his memory suddenly refreshed the details previously hidden in the depths of his consciousness. He guessed that she was probably the madwoman Floan, a figure from the Empire about whom there were rumors and horror stories, and this made him wary. He was completely unceremonious in his statements, allowing himself to study her hair, not paying attention to possible displeasure, as if he were studying an important sign. His attention was drawn to his hair, which turned out to be similar to Madame Floan's hair, but she immediately noted that he was crazy and too bold in his judgment. She emphasized that it was extremely rude to speak about girls like that, especially in front of a fragile lady, and he was surprised at how seriously she took manners and etiquette. He was stunned to hear her sternness and determination, because she looked quite formidable, demonstrating inner strength and self-confidence despite her fragility. Meanwhile, Caden arrived at her family's residence to discuss funding for the experiment, not panicking, but determined to force the Imperial authorities to act. However, it was a long time ago. He saw her only briefly, for a few moments, so he hardly had time to remember Margaret's face well enough. He thought, looking at her, trying to correlate fragmentary memories with reality, without losing interest in the unusual girl in front of him. Margaret decided to act faster, taking the initiative and asking directly who he was and why he had appeared in her world, demanding clarity and control over the situation. He introduced himself as Caden, the chief archmage, in a reserved and confident manner, trying to impress the girl and make her understand the seriousness of his intentions. He then asked if she had heard anything about him before, as if testing whether she was familiar with his reputation and influence in the world of the Empire and magic. She shook her head to show that his name meant nothing to her, that she was not familiar with his actions and position in society, remaining independent. This allowed him to assume that she was definitely not Lady Floan, and a feeling of relief appeared in his soul, because the frightening figure of the Imperial Mistress did not stand before him. When Margaret confirmed this, he smiled inwardly, realizing that the situation was less dangerous than it might have seemed, and now he could behave more easily. He made a mental note that he couldn't stand Lady Floan, and these words caused Margaret to feel a chill inside, as if the blood had frozen in her veins, and the feeling of threat intensified. His threat sounded far more ominous than anything she had heard from Edward, and it made her truly afraid of Caden's strength and determination. Caden could take someone's life without a twinge of conscience, and this was terrifying, but at the same time, it demonstrated his power and willingness to act without hesitation. Suddenly, something to the side caught his attention, and he looked around as if trying to find any minor threats or anything that might have escaped his notice. He looked again in the other direction, and Margaret did not understand what exactly he was doing. Her confusion grew, because his behavior was unpredictable and strange. Suddenly, he made an incomprehensible sound, which confused the girl even more, making her wary and try to understand what was happening to the man in front of her. He pressed himself against her, and the lady was completely confused, not understanding how to react to the sudden and close interaction with this mysterious archmage. She couldn't comprehend what kind of tricks, what strange games Caden was playing in front of her, and this caused anxiety and a feeling of danger at the same time. He himself was embarrassed, realizing the strangeness of the situation, and internally noted that his actions were too bold and unusual for ordinary communication with girls. He began to press himself against her neck, noting that her body smelled pleasant, and this sensation simultaneously surprised and frightened Margaret, making her think about salvation. Margaret realized that the moment demanded immediate action. She couldn't stay close, and her instincts forced her to act to protect herself from Caden. She kicked him in the leg and tried to run away, trying to distance herself from him, feel in control of the situation, and escape the unexpected closeness. He screamed for her to stop, but she couldn't breathe. And even if Caden hadn't intended to cause death, the fear of his presence was too great. She always felt danger around him. And at the cliff, she jumped on a vine, using her skills to escape, saving herself from the potential threat. There was a constant tremor of fear in her soul. The anticipation of possible death at his hand made her heart pound, even when he wasn't actively pursuing her. Leaping easily to the other side, she glanced back to make sure Caden was behind her, checking if it was safe for her to continue. She realized that he had indeed been left behind, and she even more so did not want to be near a man whose abilities and intentions inspired horror and mistrust. She had enough of Edward, and this realization strengthened her resolve to flee. She was not going to remain in a situation where Caden's power could threaten her freedom or life. Caden was amazed to see her abilities, realizing that the girl who called herself fragile actually displayed agility and skill worthy of astonishment. She continued to amaze him with her stunts, which proved her courage and determination, not allowing him to underestimate her physical abilities and intelligence. Over time, Margaret was able to leave, hoping that Caden would not pursue her further, feeling relieved and temporarily free of his presence. She accidentally ended up with his talisman in her hands, and while distracted, she took the pendant with her, not suspecting that it was precisely this item that he could start pursuing. Perhaps Caden was chasing her because of the talisman, and that made her wary, realizing that the item was important to his motivation and future actions. At the same time, Margaret noticed that the sun was already setting, and the day was drawing to a close, creating an air of urgency and reminding her of the need to find safe shelter. She understood that the night would be dangerous, and any mistake could cost her freedom or life. So she tried to act carefully, using her skills and intuition. The sun was setting, painting the world in orange and red hues, and Margaret knew she had to move faster to get out of sight of Caden before dark. She realized that there were still many obstacles ahead, but now every step was decisive, and her determination and skills allowed her to hope for a successful escape and maintain her own safety. Monsters were expected to appear in the gorge soon, so Margaret knew they had to move faster or the danger would become unbearable. She had already run quite far from the cave, and at the same time, she knew that Edward was left there alone, wounded and vulnerable, without the ability to defend himself. At the moment, taking care of herself was the most important thing, because if she didn't survive, then there was no way she could help Edward. From behind her, from a deep gorge, came a strange sound that made her freeze and listen to every rustle around her. The rock she had taken refuge under turned out to be a good place to wait out the night, so Margaret decided to hide there and remain unnoticed. She planned to head back at dawn, but suddenly she felt something unusual inside the rock crevice that caught her attention. Deciding to take a look, she was shocked. In front of her lay a neat box, an unexpected find that could change the course of events. Margaret couldn't believe her eyes. Inside was a first aid kit, exactly the same as the original one Juliana had found. Then she realized that this was a chance for salvation, and decided to unpack the box, hoping that the contents would help her cope with the difficulties. She began to carefully examine the medications, studying each package and trying to understand which ones would be needed first. It seemed as if the memories had merged in Margaret's head, and she even began to forget some of the Korean names. But the essence of the medications remained clear. In any case, what was in the box should have been enough to help Edouard and ease his condition. She was pleased with the find, but a sudden rustle behind her made her wary, again sensing danger nearby. Realizing that they might be monsters, Margaret quickly hid under a rock, trying to remain unnoticed and hold her breath. She didn't expect the creature to appear so quickly, so she was startled, feeling a cold fear creeping inside her. The monster moved quietly, as if hoping to remain unnoticed, which forced her to hold back every sound and movement. Listening more closely, she realized that these were not wolves, but someone walking on two legs. The steps were too human for an animal. The creature seemed to be searching for something. Perhaps it was Caden, although Margaret wasn't sure, but interest was mixed with fear. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to peek out from her hiding place, carefully sticking her head out and trying not to give away her presence. The creature turned out to be much larger than a man, twice as thick as usual, and its size caused Margaret both horror and awe. It was completely covered in thick fur, which made it even more frightening, and Margaret could hardly contain her trembling with fear. She had no doubt that before her stood a real monster, not a man, and the danger was very real and imminent. The thought of her own death flashed through her mind as the monster stretched out its paws towards her, and fear clenched in her chest, restricting her movements. She was ready to accept the fact that the monster would grab her, eat her, or torture her, and only the memory of Edward gave her a faint hope. She desperately wanted Edward to be there to protect her, and she tried to imagine his strength and courage at that moment. The monster began to lift the stone under which she was hiding, and Margaret felt her breath catch in fear of the inevitable. But at the last moment, it heard a sound from the other side and was distracted, leaving her temporarily safe and allowing her to rest. Margaret heard the monster slowly moving away, and her heart gradually calmed. although anxiety still did not leave her. Margaret did not sleep a wink all night, afraid that the creature would return and attack again, and every rustle made her shudder. She tried her best to suppress the sobs that were bursting from her chest, trying not to let the emotions break through and not give away their presence. For the first time in her life, she wanted so much to see Edward, to feel him next to her, to feel the security that he always gave. With the first rays of the sun, she decided to move forward, intending to fulfill her plan and find a way to Edward despite her fatigue. She certainly didn't resemble any animal, having long studied the descriptions of mutating creatures and understood that on this island there could be any danger. But there wasn't a single creature around that looked like the monster that had tried to attack her yesterday, and that was a little reassuring. Even the wolves she had encountered before looked different from the monster of yesterday, and Margaret knew the threat level was rising here. The animals were different from those described in the book, and the difficulty of survival was constantly increasing, causing her to doubt her own abilities. She wondered if she would even be able to get out of here alive, because every new day brought new dangers and trials. First, it was necessary to treat Edward's wounds and give him medicine to ease the pain and restore his strength before moving on. Margaret knew that the medication package would help him feel better, and she was ready to use it immediately, without delay. She approached the supposed place where Edward was supposed to be, thinking that he had already been waiting for a long time and needed her help. But instead of him, there was no one there. And this surprise took her by surprise, causing slight anxiety and bewilderment. She didn't understand where Edward could have disappeared to, and in surprise, she dropped the box of medicines, realizing the sudden emptiness around her. It never occurred to her that he might simply leave, and this added to Margaret's sense of confusion and uncertainty. She felt sad, perhaps because Edward met the main character of the story in her absence, and this explained his sudden disappearance. If he had met her, he would probably have left disappointed, and since Edward was not around, there was no point in staying here without a purpose. She decided to go back to her original plan and go looking for the bunker or cabin alone, intending to act cautiously. But suddenly, turning back, Margaret heard footsteps behind her, and her heart sank from unexpected joy and fear at the same time. It was Edward, looking miserable and exhausted, and she was overcome with both relief and anxiety at seeing him again. He said her name with difficulty, and Margaret felt emotions overwhelm her as the long-awaited meeting turned out to be real. She hadn't expected to see him here at all, and this surprise caught her off guard, making her freeze for a moment. Out of a lack of understanding of the situation, she simply greeted him, not knowing how else to express her feelings and ease the tension of the moment. Margaret thought he had left without her, which explained his sudden absence earlier, though it was clearer now. He seemed to have recovered a little, and this pleased her, because the visible signs of recovery gave hope for a quick improvement in his condition. His face suddenly changed, and Margaret had a hard time understanding why his gaze became so stern and angry, as if she had done something terrible. Perhaps while she was gone, something important or unpleasant happened to him that suddenly affected his mood and the way he looked at her. Margaret soon realized that he might think that she had deliberately hidden or run away from him, and this was what caused his displeasure. To avoid any misunderstandings, she immediately tried to explain that one should not jump to conclusions and accuse her without evidence. She reminded him that she had only gone out to get some medicinal herbs, and that her actions were completely understandable and safe for everyone, including him. Moreover, Margaret brought something much more useful than simple herbs, an item that could really help in an emergency. This wasn't an ordinary herbal collection, but a real first aid kit, a kind of epic drop that she could use immediately. He, of course, had not the slightest idea of such modern or magical medical terms and their true value. After that, she decided to get up to check his condition and assess whether it was possible to begin providing assistance right then and there. Margaret stated that it was necessary to provide first aid so that his wounds would not become more complicated and cause serious consequences in the near future. However, he grabbed her unexpectedly, and she instantly felt embarrassed, not expecting such closeness and a sharp reaction from him. She couldn't understand why he was hugging her, and at the same time saying that she couldn't take such risks anymore, as if his concern was mixed with irritation. He explained that his injuries were not so serious that she would worry about him and put herself in danger for him. He was too close, and his concern was understandable. He didn't want her to risk herself for some herbs or medicine for him. Margaret was completely confused, not understanding where this strange atmosphere between them came from and why he was behaving so unusually. For those who observed the events, it would be useful to remember that everything happened completely differently the day before, and now the situation seems to have been rewound. Edward opened his eyes and was confused as to where he was, as if time and space around him had changed or shifted. He noticed that he was in a cave, covered with something, and this added even more uncertainty because he did not immediately remember what had happened. Then he saw a bandage on his hand and realized that someone had taken care of his wound, because before it was open and bleeding. It turned out to be a piece of Margaret's dress, carefully placed for bandaging, which immediately surprised him because he had never seen her in a medical role. He certainly didn't think that such a softie like Margaret was capable of treating wounds on her own and knew how to use medical equipment. At the same time, he had no idea where Margaret herself was, or what she was doing while his wounds were healing, which added even more anxiety. He remembered what she had said about searching for medicinal herbs, and although little time had passed, events had developed very quickly and unpredictably. From his observations, everything on this island is repeating itself cyclically, and monsters have already appeared, threatening anyone who dares to go beyond the safety limits. The magical aspect of the situation became apparent. During the day, the danger does not manifest itself, but as evening approaches, the monsters return, creating constant tension and threat. Understanding this, Edward hurried to look for Margaret, not wanting to waste a minute to make sure that she was okay and safe. There was no time to wander through the forest now, but he felt strange emotions, not like before, as if an inner feeling was forcing him to act differently. He would never have risked himself in a normal situation, much less gone in search of a girl. But his inner unease forced him to move forward. Margaret did everything she could to help him and save his life, showing determination and courage that no one expected of her. Without her intervention, his chances of survival would have been minimal. And it is safe to say that it was her actions that prevented tragedy. And yet, Edward still behaved strangely with her, as if he had forgotten how much effort she had put in, and sometimes showed irritation that seemed unfounded. He recalled all their past conversations, and his anger at himself grew because he realized that he had behaved rudely and did not appreciate her concern. It became clear to him that she was now going through just as hard a time as he was. But all this time, he had only been causing pain with his words, not noticing her suffering. She, like him, found herself alone in an unfamiliar area where she could not rely on anyone. And this made her situation extremely vulnerable and anxious. Edward considered himself a complete idiot and barely made his way through the dark forest, barely keeping himself moving and not losing his presence of mind. All night long, he prayed desperately and begged the higher powers that Margaret would survive, that she and he would be okay, despite the dangers. Therefore, at the moment of meeting, he felt incredible relief and joy that she remained alive and was nearby, albeit in unusual circumstances. Margaret did not understand what was happening, and her confusion was strong because events were developing too quickly and unexpectedly for her. He stated that from now on, she could address him simply by his first name, getting rid of the formal distance and titles. Margaret was surprised, asking why he decided to do this, because his behavior seemed too strange and unusual for him. He was indeed acting strangely, as if his inner emotions had completely changed his attitude towards her, which made the situation even more confusing. She couldn't believe that he had suddenly become so kind, and she thought that perhaps people really did change in critical situations, as had happened here. But the change was too drastic for her to fully believe, so the doubt remained and prevented her from trusting him completely. He noticed a bruise on her and assumed she must be in pain, asking who had caused her the injury, showing unexpected concern. Margaret was completely confused, not understanding why he was suddenly showing concern and interest in her condition, which seemed unreal to her. She explained that she was fine and that it was just a scratch that didn't require any special attention or concern. She pulled his hand away, expressing surprise and bewilderment, because she still could not comprehend that it was he who had begun to show concern for her. She thought that perhaps he was still delirious, because his sudden concern for her seemed so unusual for his character. He asked her what she meant, and she simply replied that she was fine and did not require any extra care in trying to get things back to normal. This only adds new complications to their situation, forcing them to think through every step more carefully than before. Therefore, she suggested leaving everything as it was before, without interfering and without creating unnecessary problems. He remembered his own words when he advised her not to build illusions and not to entertain hopes that would not come true. He said that this would only complicate the situation for both of them, making the situation even more confusing and unpleasant for them. And suddenly, Margaret realized that perhaps Edward had heard his own words, and now they had come back to him. But she decided that enough of these games was enough. She couldn't relax just because she felt sorry for him. Therefore, she noted that she felt as if she was about to pass out from tension and fatigue. She suggested that instead of all this, they go hunting to change the scenery and take their minds off their worries. But first, it was necessary to take care of his wounds, because they could not be left without attention and care. Edouard was very confused and bewildered. He was not sure whether he understood and did everything correctly, but he managed to thank her, although at first she slightly frightened him with her actions and intentions. She said that the procedures would be a little painful, but this was necessary for proper treatment and quick healing. After some time, Margaret had completely treated all his wounds, carefully and thoroughly, without missing a single detail. She noted that everything was ready because she wrapped it with bandages and made sure that the treatment was carried out correctly. Edward said it looked impressive, and she replied that it was enough for the initial recovery. He didn't even know how to properly respond to her confidence and the way she treated him. He asked how she knew it was an antiseptic and how she managed to choose the right product. But on the bottle, there were inscriptions in a language unfamiliar to him, which made everything even more mysterious and incomprehensible. And then, Margaret decided that she needed to come up with something in this situation to explain her actions without raising suspicion. Therefore, she said that this remedy is used far to the east of their empire, where it is known and widespread. It so happened that she studied this particular dialect, which allowed her to understand the purpose and method of using the product. In fact, Margaret quickly came up with an excuse in her memory. And fortunately, Edward did not suspect anything strange. And in general, she didn't understand what was going on in the head of the author of the novel, who decided to add the first aid kit from Korea to the world. There were plenty of mysteries and oddities here, but they had to be dealt with, otherwise the situation could get out of control. Edward decided to remember the strange mark on her face, which made him think about what was left unsaid. He noticed that she never told him how he came into her life and how she ended up next to him. Margaret thought that perhaps he was asking for a reason, but that he knew something and was trying to understand the situation more deeply. Although, if you think about it, there is no point in hiding her meeting with Caden from him, because the events will sooner or later become clear. When the main plot begins, he will definitely encounter the main character, and Caden will be there, as if destined. So she said that she came across a strange man who suddenly appeared in her path and made her wary. These words made Edward jump up, and she explained that it was just a pendant that had fallen from his clothes and landed right on her face. He asked how this was even possible while the girl was bandaging her leg after a minor injury. She explained that it just so happened that she ended up underneath him and he ended up on top, creating a strange and awkward situation. When Edward heard this, he became furious, not understanding how this happened and what really happened. She didn't understand what exactly had caused his reaction, since he had just crushed a rock into dust with his bare hands, a show of strength. He asked if she knew of similar situations, and she said that she could now explain everything in more detail. And this happened because of that very pendant that was on his clothes and accidentally caused her a small wound. He immediately understood what was being said, and Margaret noted that he quickly realized what had really happened. And she asked how often he had fits of rage at the sight of blood, to understand his reaction to danger. She knew the question sounded rude, but they would be traveling together, and it was important for her to know about his specifics. And the situation itself was quite risky, requiring caution and careful attention to every action. He said the attacks were controllable, and began after his return from the war, where he rarely encountered blood. Margaret said that if he knew how to suppress them, he should definitely explain how to do it to avoid danger. After all, last time he managed to come to his senses, which means the method really exists and works in critical moments. She wondered what exactly had helped him calm down a few days ago and cope with his unexpected rage. And then she realized the absurdity of her question, because the answer was simpler than she could have imagined at first. His answer was that it was she who was able to calm him down. Margaret's mere presence and actions were enough. He added that as soon as she ordered him to sit still, the attack immediately passed, leaving no trace of irritation. This caused Margaret to question whether she had understood his words correctly, and whether her actions had really had that effect. The gentleman was noticeably embarrassed and did not know how to react to the situation correctly. His thoughts were racing, trying to find the right words. He said that as a child, when he competed with his brothers, he had to learn to control his emotions and actions without outside help. On the battlefield, when he lost his comrades, no one told him enough. No one tried to stop him from acting, which left a deep mark. Now it was she who ordered him to stop certain actions, and this feeling contradicted his habits and internal resistance. Perhaps he really needed such words to stop his uncontrollable impulse, at least for a while. He has already said that these are the consequences left over from the war. Consequences that are difficult to cope with even years later. The memories of the Battle of Romarazani were so vivid and painful that the sight of blood instantly drove him crazy, losing control. When he cut his hand, Margaret immediately tried to intervene, trying to prevent the situation from getting worse. But he said that a minor wound is not yet a tragedy, and not a reason to panic, and that it is not yet worth intervening. Then she realized that the situation, although alarming, was still under control, and that it was better than she could have expected. However, treating the after effects of this wound proved extremely difficult, and the efforts required patience and caution. There was no one to support him, no one to comfort him and relieve the tension, leaving everything on Margaret's shoulders. He said he suspected that if there was a word that could stop his attack, it might be the solution for such cases. And that word, apparently, was what Margaret said at that moment, accidentally producing the desired effect. It seems she inadvertently revealed something that was best kept secret. And in the original, Juliana resolved the issue through physical intimacy. But this was not a real solution to his internal trauma, and could not completely remove the consequences of past experiences. Who would have thought that such an ideal man needs someone to control him, even in small things, to keep himself in check? It's good that there is a control word that can bring at least some stability and security in moments of weakness. But if the situation is again related to blood, it is necessary to avoid such circumstances and act with the utmost caution. The gentleman inquired about the medicine used to treat wounds, seeking to understand the method of recovery and care. She showed him an ointment intended for treating damaged areas of the skin, explaining its purpose and properties. He took some of the ointment on his finger and tried to carefully apply it to his face, not realizing how strange it might feel. She asked why he needed this, surprised by such an unusual action, and trying to understand his intentions. He explained that the ointment should also be applied to her face to speed up healing, taking care of her health and safety. He also asked her what else she had learned about the man, trying to gather complete information and assess the situation. Margaret said that she had already told everything she could, because she was too close to him, and this created a certain risk. She kicked him to create distance and quickly ran away, realizing that staying nearby was dangerous and undesirable. After that, she got lost and hid until the morning, when they left the island, trying not to move alone and avoiding unnecessary attention. Margaret noted that she too belonged to this situation, but now it was a lie, because she had already met Caden and knew that the path had become more difficult. Simply being near Edward did not provide a way out and did not help solve problems. It only complicated her situation and emotional state. Therefore, she needed to find at least some clue as quickly as possible to determine the location of the bunker, but the difficult journey was taking its toll, draining her strength. Margaret eventually took to her bed, spending several days recovering from illness, realizing that fatigue and stress had taken their toll on her body. She admitted that she did not expect to experience an upset stomach, which added to the anxiety and discomfort of her situation. It was better to drink purified water, even if it required extra effort and was troublesome, than to risk your health and well-being. First, she placed a container with water from the stream higher up and an empty one lower down, securing them to the ground to create minimal pressure for the liquid to flow. Then, it was still necessary to throw a long cloth between two coconut bowls of different heights so that the water could drain without losing the precious resource. Over time, impurities from the water will gradually settle to the bottom of the upper container, and moisture, under the influence of gravity, will slowly flow down the fabric into the empty lower bowl, leaving the water almost clean. If you boil this collected water, it will become completely suitable for drinking, without impurities or foreign odors, which will allow you to not feel thirsty. Although the dress got damaged in the process, fortunately, the undershirt was cotton, soft and comfortable, so the inconvenience was not too severe. She thought to herself that she had never noticed before how caring Edward could be, especially when he looked after her during her illness. She wondered if he had really begun to trust her and was now treating her differently than before, with respect and attention. If the unshakable rule of the original had not been in effect, she might not have run away from Edward and would have tried to stay close to him, exploring the possibility of another path. But after all this torment, there was still a chance that meeting Edward would change her, just as it happened in the original story, and everything would take a new turn. Sadly, it cannot be ruled out that events could take a completely unexpected turn, requiring care and caution. She said that before that point, it was necessary to find the exact location of the bunker in order to know where to go and how to proceed further without unnecessary risk. But Edouard noted that he had already said that she should rest, because without rest, actions could be dangerous and ineffective. She explained that she still needed to do something, so she needed to go hunting to prepare for further events on the island, and he agreed that they could go back, as she had suggested. But first, they needed to make sure they were full and had enough strength before the next journey. For some reason, he suddenly stopped, and she almost collided with him because she did not expect such a sudden change in his behavior and was a little disoriented. Margaret looked at him indignantly and wanted to understand why he suddenly stopped, because they were only planning to move on and nothing was impeding their movement. But then she noticed a figure in front of her and was surprised to realize that it was Caden himself, who seemed to have appeared here unexpectedly and mysteriously. She was completely confused and could not understand how he ended up in this particular place, because according to the logic of events, it seemed impossible. Edward said that this was the same person who had once hurt her, and now he was right in front of them, which made the situation tense and dangerous. As they got closer, she was finally convinced that it was indeed Caden, and there was no doubt left about who stood before them and what his intentions were. Edward asked whether this man was the one who had caused her suffering, because now their further strategy of action on the island depended on the answer. She confirmed that it was indeed him, and was sure that she had managed to hide from him before, but now he had somehow managed to appear here, which made her wary. Apparently he had wandered and still reached this place, and then Edward decided that it would be best to tie him up to eliminate any possibility of dangerous behavior. Margaret was shocked by this decision, and Edward explained that this man could be dangerous, so they should exercise extreme caution and act carefully. You should be very careful, act without haste, and take into account all the risks in order not to expose yourself to unnecessary danger and maintain control of the situation. You need to hurry before the sun sets because darkness can add complexity to your actions, as well as increase the risk of a surprise attack or other problems. Suddenly, Caden grabbed her arm sharply, and the movement caught her off guard, causing an immediate reaction and the desire to break free from his grip. Edward immediately intervened and pulled her towards him, protecting and shielding her from a sudden attack, trying to prevent the situation from getting out of control. He checked to see if she was okay, and she reported that she felt fine, only a little alarmed by Caden's sudden action, which had scared her. His grip was so harsh that she flinched, so she suggested that they move everyone to a safe haven to avoid further dangerous situations. Edward asked what was going on and what she meant, trying to understand her proposal and intentions in order to act according to the plan and safety. He asked her to stop so as not to take any rash actions that could complicate the situation and put them all in danger. She thanked him for his help and support, realizing that without his intervention, the consequences could have been much more serious and dangerous for her. Edward noticed that there was a mark on her arm from her collision with Caden, which served as a reminder of the recent incident and potential threat. Margaret was sincerely grateful to him for his help and care, feeling that there was a person nearby whom she could rely on in a critical situation. He grabbed her hand and asked if he should kill Caden to eliminate the threat once and for all, testing her judgment before making his decision. Margaret immediately demanded that he stop, because such words were too harsh and dangerous, and her sense of justice did not allow her to remain silent. She emphasized that it was impossible to speak like that, since even discussing the murder was unacceptable and could lead to unpredictable consequences for everyone. She asked him what he meant by that, because that was not right. You had to remain calm and act sensibly, without unnecessary anger and hasty decisions. He had to control his anger and emotions. Otherwise, it could turn into serious problems, and only cold calculation would help maintain order. And then he immediately stopped, realizing that she was right, and no longer allowed his emotions to influence his actions, so as not to harm either her or others. He said that he understood her and smiled, demonstrating agreement and willingness to follow her advice in order to safely resolve the current situation together. He added that if she really wanted, he would listen to her instructions and take her opinion into account in the future, maintaining trust and cooperation. But she didn't understand why he was smiling and what was really going on, because this man turned out to be the great magician Caden, which caused her bewilderment and respect. Of course, he immediately recognizes such famous personalities, because on the continent, it is difficult not to know about the existence of one of the 5 great magicians whose reputation was well known. He is the crown prince of the empire, and it would be strange not to know about the existence of such a significant figure who could influence the events of the entire continent. He said that first it was worth moving the things, and then Caden himself, in order to prepare a safe place and maintain control of the situation without unnecessary risks. All this was done because he didn't like the idea of Caden being there, but his knowledge of magic could be useful, so they would take him with them. After tying him up for safety, he asked her what she thought about it, and she was surprised that he was asking her opinion, because it meant that the level of trust between them had grown significantly. He also noted that if she refused to tie him up, he would leave him there, because the man was really too dangerous to be left uncontrolled. She said he didn't show any alarm and admitted that she shared his opinion, realizing that safety was the most important thing in this situation. Therefore, she suggested that they tie him up immediately, without delaying for a minute, in order to exclude any unpredictable consequences. But it seemed like it was too serious for him, and she felt like he was still too tense and wary. She couldn't understand where he got such injuries from, or how deep his old wounds were that made him cautious. When she realized that the loud noise in the forest had distracted a wild animal, she knew it was due to Caden's actions. This unexpected roar echoed throughout the forest, and it was this that distracted the aggressive creature, which could have attacked if not for the intervention of the Archmage. But she decided to ask all the questions later, when he was fully awake and able to explain normally what had happened. She noted that his wounds were too severe, and therefore it was absolutely not worth looking directly into his face or checking his condition too closely. Then Edward said that it seemed it would be better to tie him up too, to avoid the risk of another surprise attack. He made a sudden dash towards it, but she stopped him with her foot, indicating that he shouldn't move, and it worked, holding him in place. He instantly blushed, realizing that he had succumbed to her control, and stopped, listening to her stern order and not taking a step. This method really worked, as Edward had previously claimed, and she became convinced that it was possible to manage the situation without violence. With his usual strength and fury, he would have long ago thrown her off and broken free. But now everything was under control, and the danger was reduced to a minimum. Unexpectedly, after she openly showed her determination, he began to behave more obediently, submitting to her will and not resisting. He asked to remove his leg, but the girl insisted that he should stop and observe the order so as not to harm himself. She ordered it to be carried out immediately, showing that safety was paramount and leaving no room for doubt or argument. As a result, he immediately fell to the ground, completely obeying her command and realizing that resistance now would only make the situation worse. It's good that everything went without serious consequences, and we could move on to the next step without any unnecessary complications. She decided to tie him up first, realizing that she would have to be extremely careful in the future and not allow the risk of repeated aggression. Although she didn't understand how these two had even survived in the original world without her intervention, since she had never seen Juliana control Edward so carefully. She then decided to simply accept the situation, realizing that the first thing she needed to do was stop the bleeding and apply a bandage to prevent infection. After some time, Edward fully woke up, not yet fully understanding what had happened and what measures had been taken for his safety. He was confused and didn't understand what he had done, and she carefully asked if he was okay to make sure that his condition was stable. He saw Margaret, and she informed him that they would now carefully untie him so that he could relax a little after what had happened. He expressed a strong sense of shame and wondered if he had harmed her by worrying about her well-being after all the events. The girl replied that she was fine. Caden's wound had been treated and ointment had been applied, so it would soon heal without complications or pain. But he clarified that he didn't just mean her physical condition, but was interested in how she was feeling emotionally after everything that had happened. He showed concern by asking how she was feeling, and it made her feel a little embarrassed, realizing that he was genuinely worried. After these words, she blushed slightly, not expecting such attentiveness and sincere concern, which made her feel slightly awkward. She assured him that she was fine and that they could stand calmly without worrying, as there was no longer any threat and the situation was under control. He said that if she suddenly wanted to get rid of an unpleasant condition or pain, she should immediately tell him so that he could help. It wasn't that difficult, he claimed, and he could easily handle any problem she pointed out, showing confidence in his abilities. But it wasn't so easy to get rid of some discomfort, and she said that he shouldn't break down again. Otherwise, everything would not go according to plan. Edward believed that everything would be easier if she was honest and communicated her feelings without hesitation in order to avoid the risk of complications. There was something stinging in his words that made her doubt whether he had truly calmed down completely and whether his reaction could be trusted completely. She thought that perhaps he might go crazy, just like in the novel, so they carefully treated his wounds and watched him all night without leaving his side. Perhaps the one who attacked Edward was poisonous and left traces that now had to be taken into account in further actions. Caden gradually recovered, and by the next day, his condition had become more stable, although he was still weakened from the recent events. However, his breathing became even, and he seemed to feel better, so they decided to go hunting to test their strength and prepare for the coming day. They decided to leave Caden and explore the cave's surroundings together, so as not to disturb him and at the same time to scout out the area. Margaret was extremely hot. Her clothes were sticking to her body, so walking became increasingly difficult, and every movement was a struggle. As far as she remembered, the bunker, or hut, was supposed to be located at the foot of a huge mountain, surrounded by forest and rocks, which made its location difficult to access. There was a steep cliff nearby, and getting there was not easy, so every step required caution and attention to avoid falling down. The last time she climbed to the top with Edward, there were exactly 3 large mountains on this island, each with its own characteristics and dangers. First, they decided to search the area around the mountain that Edward and I had climbed, and if there was no bunker or hut there, they would have to check the rest. They had to explore the other 2 mountains to make sure that the desired place was not hidden from view and would not go unnoticed. Perhaps because of the heat, everything around seemed somehow yellowish, as if the sun's rays were painting the space in a strange shade. Margaret felt strange and heavy, the heat was oppressive, and every step was taken with great effort, which made moving almost painful. Suddenly, she caught on a root or a rock and almost fell, but Edward instantly grabbed her, holding her and not letting her fall. He told Margaret to be careful, reminding her that every wrong step could lead to injury, and that she needed to watch her feet more closely. There was a scar on Edward's arm, obviously from the battlefield, which spoke of his experience and the harsh trials he had been through. The gentleman asked if everything was okay, and Markovich assured him that, in fact, everything was fine, although the tension was still palpable in the air. Margaret noted that she was just a little hot, and this feeling made it difficult for her to concentrate, creating a feeling of tiredness and heaviness. She understood that someone else's body should not be crushed or used, so she tried to act carefully and not disturb Edouard with unnecessary movements. After that, she barely had time to blink before he grabbed her in his arms, which completely caught her off guard and caused her great fear. Margaret was very scared because she did not expect such a sudden action, and her heart beat faster from surprise. She wanted him to stop, reminding him that if they continued walking like this, he would quickly tire and it would do no good to anyone. But the gentleman said that if they continued at their usual pace, Margaret might faint from heat and fatigue, and therefore they had to act differently. He explained that there was a stream ahead where she could cool off, and even if she didn't want to, she would have to endure it for the sake of safety and rest. Still, Margaret decided to agree, because she was really having a hard time, and she understood that it would be safer and easier to overcome the remaining path. As they approached the stream, her skin felt the heat from the blazing sun, and she sighed in relief as she felt the cool water promise relief. Edward said he would stand guard so she could cool off in peace and call him whenever she wanted, providing safety and support nearby. He also stood next to her to be ready and help if she needed anything, showing that he cared and was willing to respond to her needs. But when he looked in her direction, he felt very embarrassed because he accidentally saw part of her back, and this caused unexpected emotions. So he decided to turn away and moved away a little to pull himself together and calm down, avoiding an awkward situation and keeping his distance. He needed to pull himself together because he was very embarrassed and understood that such thoughts only interfered and distracted him from reason. He tried not to think about what had just popped into his head, trying to control his emotions and stay focused on reality and safety. He felt unprepared and not confident enough to cope with what was happening without outside help or support. But the next day the lady came up and dragged him to her, demonstrating determination and persistence so that he could not ignore her request. Margaret said that her hands couldn't reach the right place and therefore she needed help. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to cope on her own. She asked him to carefully unbutton her dress, explaining that this was necessary in order to avoid problems and keep the clothes dry and intact. Edward asked again, thinking that he had misunderstood her request, to make sure that everything was clear and that he really understood what was required of him. The girl repeated once again that she needed help, emphasizing the importance of the situation and the need for his participation to avoid trouble. So she asked him to unbutton her dress, explaining that it was really necessary and that she could not manage it herself because of the restrictions. She felt awkward asking, but she hoped that he would understand her situation and be patient in helping her through this delicate situation. She couldn't reach the clasp, she only had one dress, and if it got wet, it would be impossible to change, which created additional stress. He closed his eyes and carefully tried to unbutton her dress, understanding the delicacy of the moment and trying to act carefully and respectfully. She asked him so much that he could not refuse, feeling responsible and wanting to help, despite his embarrassment and inner turmoil. When he touched her, she sighed softly, and this only increased his embarrassment, showing how unexpected and intimate the situation was. He asked her to tell him what she most wanted to do when she got off the island, trying to distract her thoughts and understand her desires in a more easy-to-understand way. It was a very unexpected question for her, which caught her off guard and made her think about her real priorities and her own desires. So she thought about it, feeling a strong desire to wash herself with soap first, enjoying the cleanliness and the feeling of comfort after all the hardships she had experienced on this strange island. She also wanted to try the dishes that were served here. Curiosity pushed her towards new tastes and sensations because it was all completely unusual. The last dinner at home remained in my memory as something amazing, almost like a perfect moment that I wanted to experience again, although now everything seemed completely different. Of course, it wasn't she who ate then, but Margaret. But the memories of that taste remained vivid, as if she were sitting at that table again and smelling the aromas of the dishes. Now her memories merged with the memories of the main character, and although the world around her was new, delicious food still remained an important part of her life. No matter how beautiful the jewelry she could wear here, her thoughts kept returning to Korea, the place where she was born and raised and which was so far away. Even though she was a complete orphan there, without friends and no one was waiting for her, this place still remained a part of her past, to which she sometimes involuntarily reached out. So she decided to ask Edward what he most wanted to do when he finally got out of this strange world and returned to his normal life. He replied that he didn't even know, friends, what exactly he would like to do, as if he himself didn't yet understand what he really wanted from the future. She tried to understand what his answer meant, since she had already formulated her desires, and he treated it in some frivolous, almost carefree way. He said that if he told the truth, he would feel awkward. And this intrigued her, because it was difficult to imagine what exactly could cause such an embarrassing effect. She wondered about the possible reasons for his awkwardness, trying to figure out what was behind his words and what feelings he was actually experiencing at that moment. He mentioned that he had unbuttoned her dress a long time ago, but she still remained motionless, as if frozen in midair, not daring to take a step or change the situation. And Mark said that he should have told her about this earlier, because such things always need to be clarified in a timely manner, so that misunderstandings do not arise. She couldn't understand when he became so impudent, because it was completely at odds with the image of Edward, who always seemed reserved and polite. Indeed, this was not at all like Edward. and it was strange to her to see in him these new character traits that had previously seemed impossible. He apologized for his behavior, and she insisted that he not turn around under any circumstances, as the situation was becoming too tense and uncomfortable. Seriously, she noted to herself that he had really changed, and this caused mixed feelings of surprise, bewilderment, and slight irritation at the same time. The water was surprisingly pleasant, and she enjoyed swimming, enjoying the coolness that gently enveloped her body and gave her relaxation after a busy day. It was cool and very comfortable there, as if nature itself was inviting you to stay for a moment to feel the lightness and freedom of movement without restrictions. But the reconnaissance still needed to be completed, and it was necessary to return before sunset in order to complete all the work and not find themselves in a dangerous situation after dark. She realized that it was time to get out of the water, put her thoughts in order, and prepare for the next stage, because staying here any longer was no longer possible and unsafe. Suddenly, she noticed that her dress had disappeared, and this unexpected fact caused her anxiety and confusion, because without it, she could not leave this place. Turning to Edward, she tried to understand what to do, and he asked curiously what happened. Noticing the anxiety and tension in her voice, she admitted that she didn't know where she could have put her dress, and this only increased the feeling of confusion because the situation seemed like a complete mystery. He expressed confusion as to why she was asking him about the dress she had put back herself, but she tried to explain that it seemed to have indeed disappeared without a trace. The girl clarified that the problem was precisely that her dress seemed to have evaporated, leaving her in mild shock and at the same time a feeling of helplessness in the face of what was happening. He asked what happened, but she shouted loudly at him not to turn around, as the situation could become even more awkward if he saw what was happening right now. He immediately realized his mistake and turned away, complying with her request, which avoided further embarrassment and maintained at least some privacy in the moment. She noted that she did not hear anyone approaching, and this only increased the feeling of mystery and anxiety, since what was happening had no obvious explanation. She didn't understand what had happened or whether anyone else was really there, but her intuition told her that the world around her still held many secrets. Edward suggested that there might be someone else here, although it was impossible to determine exactly who it was, since the signs of other people's presence were not obvious. He took a stick and said that he would explore the surrounding area, and she should remain in place and wait for his return, remaining calm and cautious. The girl didn't understand what to do next, and a feeling of hopelessness gripped her as she sat in the water, waiting for Edward to return and clarify the situation. She had to stay in the water, patiently waiting for Edward to return, trying to control her anxiety and not give in to the fear of the unknown. She couldn't explain to herself what kind of strange hell was going on around her when a man suddenly appeared holding her dress in his hands, and this caused mixed emotions. He immediately ran up to her, grabbed her, and threatened her with a spear, showing his determination to protect her interests and return the dress, preventing further misunderstandings. Edward noticed that there were so many familiar faces on this island, and this surprised him because he expected the place to be alien and unpredictable. It turned out that it was Sir Diego, a familiar commander of the Imperial Guard, whose appearance here was both unexpected and intriguing. He immediately became frightened and asked that His Highness do nothing, demonstrating respect and caution in the face of Edward's strength and authority. He asked what was going on here, but Edward replied that it seemed like he needed to clarify something, since the situation was too confusing and unclear for everyone involved. He couldn't understand how the commander of the Imperial Guard ended up on this island, because it seemed impossible and contradicted all known rules and logic. During training, he suddenly lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he was lying on the riverbank, not fully understanding what had happened or how he had ended up in that position. The master took the spear he was holding and stepped back, leaving space for reflection and analysis of the situation, demonstrating his superiority and control over what was happening. He looked away and cast a disdainful glance at the dress, assessing the situation, realizing that events had taken an unexpected turn and required a careful approach. Diego expressed gratitude for being released, but at the same time, he inquired how His Highness had gotten there, trying to understand the strangeness of the situation in which they found themselves. The gentleman replied that something similar had happened to him. He also suddenly woke up here, without any understanding of what was happening, and this made him wary. He explained that he had been doing some business in the palace when he suddenly woke up on this island, and then the gentleman asked if he had managed to find out anything or request outside help to understand the reason. But Diego admitted that nothing had been done yet, and there was no way to ask for help here, since he found himself with a duo of companions who also found themselves in the same mysterious situation as himself. The gentleman asked who exactly he was talking about, and Diego replied that he should know these people. They were Crown Prince Edward and Archbishop Rousseff, two key figures of the Empire who were there with them. It seems that they woke up on this island in the same strange and incomprehensible situation as Diego and his companions, as if the forces of fate had united all the key players at once. The gentleman noted that this was a very strange coincidence, since only key figures of the Empire and the royal person Hestia were there, which made him wonder about the hidden motives of what was happening. At first he decided that this could be another intrigue directed against him personally, but judging by the people gathered here, this version does not seem plausible and, perhaps, it is something more global. Therefore, he had absolutely no idea whose handiwork this was, and who was really behind what had brought them all here, leaving only guesses and tense anticipation of further developments. He also asked if there was anyone among his companions who might need women's clothing, as this might be connected with certain circumstances of their sudden appearance on the island. Diego replied that the situation was urgent, and that there were indeed those among his companions who might need such clothes, which added even more tension and confusion to their overall situation. It didn't seem like it was necessary for the crown prince or the archbishop, so Diego believed that the gentleman might be suspicious of him, which made him wary and choose his words carefully. At this point, the gentleman immediately pointed his spear at him, demonstrating his readiness to demand an answer and persistently seeking a direct explanation regarding this strange situation. He ordered an answer right now, without delay, which increased the pressure on Diego, forcing him to realize the seriousness of the situation and the need for an honest explanation. Diego was at a loss as to what to do, but he said that he was a knight of the Empire and was not an enemy, hoping that this excuse would be taken seriously by the master and remove the threat. Edward asked why he hadn't come up with this excuse earlier, before he took the dress from his companion, pointing out the strangeness of what was happening and the need for a logical explanation. Diego explained that among his companions there was a girl named Juliana, and he only wanted to clarify that the dress was necessary specifically for her, in order to avoid awkward or dangerous situations. He reported that among his companions there was indeed a Juliana Lucy, and that this was a girl whose role and position could explain the necessity of such an action without causing harm to others. The gentleman asked again to make sure the information was accurate, and Diego confirmed that it was indeed Juliana Lucy, a girl in an unusual position who deserved special attention. He realized that this was truly a great saint, appearing in the Empire for the first time in 100 years, and her presence here added special significance to the whole situation, making what was happening more mysterious. Juliana Lucy is a saint with unique divine powers, who has appeared in the Empire for the first time in a century, and is trapped on this island along with other key figures. It seems that even the church ministers, including Archbishop Rusev, could not escape this unexpected disaster, which further confirms the mysterious and mystical nature of their stay here. This means that the gods really do not intervene directly, and even the most powerful and holy ones were helpless before this unexpected force that brought everyone together on this island. Edward asked if this meant that the saint had no clothes, and asked again, trying to understand how serious the consequences of what happened to Juliana Lucy in this situation were. He clarified that the dress was the only clothing his companion had, and if Diego had stolen it, the saint would have been left completely naked, which could have been at least some justification for the knight's actions. Judging by the fact that Diego was silent, the saint was still dressed, which allowed Edward to draw conclusions and determine that the precautions and care for the saint had been taken. Therefore, he immediately ordered the dress to be returned to Juliana in order to prevent any unpleasant consequences and to preserve the dignity and safety of the saint in these difficult conditions. Diego, greatly frightened, immediately handed the dress back, realizing that, in this case, any delay or disobedience could lead to serious consequences and violate the master's trust. They meet here approximately once every 10 days, and if there is a need to move a long distance, Diego must notify them in advance so that all actions can be coordinated. Of course, this must happen in such a way that his companions do not know about the upcoming move, in order to avoid unnecessary anxiety and irrational actions on the part of those nearby. Diego was surprised that the gentleman was not going to go with him, and this made him think about strategy and how to act correctly in a situation where the participants in the situation are separated. Edward turned to him and reminded him that he had already said that he should answer only the questions posed, observing strict discipline and not going beyond the certain rules so as not to complicate the situation. He added that any deviation or independent action could lead to unpredictable consequences, and therefore, Diego must strictly follow the instructions, carrying out only specific assignments. Diego realized that asking questions was not an option now, so he simply bowed his head and made a slight bow, freezing in place. Edward added that if she found out a way to leave the island, she should immediately inform him and under no circumstances try to leave with anyone else. He warned that if he was angered, there would be no mercy and the consequences would be extremely unpleasant for everyone. Margaret sat on the cold shore, cowering from the chill that went right to her bones, feeling despair and loneliness. She was frozen almost to death, her body was shaking, and her thoughts were starting to get confused due to the sharp pain and fatigue. She couldn't figure out where Edward had disappeared to, or who this strange man was who had stolen her dress. Fortunately, her shirt had been left untouched. Margaret wrapped herself in her nightgown, trying to keep warm, and felt the cold slowly begin to take hold of her body, making every movement difficult. The cold became unbearable. Her trembling grew stronger with each passing moment, and it seemed that she could not endure it for another minute. If she stayed here for long, a cold would be inevitable, and her strength would finally fade away, leaving only weakness and trembling. Suddenly, a familiar voice calling her name caught her attention, and her heart began to beat faster, recognizing Edward next to her. Margaret felt joy and relief when she saw him, although he himself looked embarrassed and a little confused. He apologized for the delay and asked her about her condition with concern, as if he was afraid of causing her further discomfort. The girl was delighted to see her dress in his hands, and true happiness and warmth flared up in her soul from this unexpected find. But suddenly she felt dizzy and lost her balance, falling into the water, the cold instantly seeping inside and making her shudder. She almost no longer believed that her endurance would be enough. Like a weak fish thrown ashore, she felt powerless. After a while, she couldn't figure out where she was. Everything around her vaguely merged into one feeling of unusual softness and warmth. Edward noticed her condition and quietly said that he had finally found her, affectionately calling her Swallow, as if this would ease all the anxiety. Margaret raised her head and was surprised to realize that she was lying right on his lap, feeling his care and warmth nearby. She tried to understand what had happened, but he immediately apologized, as if he knew that it was difficult for her to explain everything at the moment. Margaret didn't understand what he was apologizing for, but she noticed that he suddenly had a fever, which added to his anxiety. He seemed to want to give her medicine, but was unsure which one would be effective, showing concern and confusion. She watched him become embarrassed and awkwardly try to help, and she felt sorry for him. It was so touching and at the same time alarming to see his helplessness. He admitted that he had never felt so helpless in his life, but Margaret reassured him, saying that it was not his fault and that he shouldn't worry. And then she suddenly remembered that her dress was missing, which caused her slight anxiety and a desire to find out where it was. Margaret asked where exactly he had found her dress, hoping that now everything would be okay and her things would be safe. Edward explained that everything happened after meeting Diego, who was in the right place at the right time to return the clothes. She tried to remember who Diego was, and gradually a name associated with the commander of the Imperial Guard came to mind. And then she realized that in front of her was the very man who maintained order on the island and possessed impressive authority. He was a model of nobility and knightly honor, but it was he who stole the clothes of a bathing woman, which left Margaret confused. Diego was Edward's man, and therefore made all his apologies on behalf of the prince, showing respect and devotion to his master. Margaret said there was no need to apologize, but Edward added that it seemed like she was afraid of Diego, and that was normal, given their difficult relationship. Diego, a straightforward and strict man, especially did not tolerate Margaret when she pestered Edward, showing aggression and causing irritation. He explained that they would no longer interfere with each other, so he decided to hide that the dress belonged to her to avoid conflict and resentment. If Margaret wants a personal apology from him, she should say so directly, and he will immediately apologize in person. But she didn't understand what was happening to him, and said that she would sort it out herself later and take revenge, not wanting to interfere right now. In response, Edward only smiled, as if understanding her intentions and respecting her desire to do things her way. Edward stroked Margaret's head, demonstrating care and affection, and this instantly calmed her anxiety and fears. After that, Margaret noticed something in his gaze that was familiar to her and gave her a feeling of warmth and safety at the same time. She didn't understand what that look meant. Perhaps he mistook her for a little puppy, causing a soft smile and quiet joy inside. Although this touch did not cause any discomfort, it evoked a strange feeling of slight reassurance, as if someone was carefully running their hand over their head. A sense of calm settled over Jinju's soul, despite the strangeness of the situation, probably because no one had ever shown such concern in her life, and this was the first time she had felt this feeling. She also wondered if there was anyone else around besides Diego, trying to figure out who else she could count on in this strange situation. The gentleman turned away and calmly stated that he did not know who else might have been involved in these events, and did not have any additional information. To escape the island, it's best to work together, as gathering information always makes sense, and the more details you can find out, the greater your chances of success. He seemed to be in exactly the same position as she, not knowing anything special, but they agreed to meet every 10 days to exchange information. If someone has useful information, they will definitely share it, so there is no reason for unnecessary anxiety or haste. Everything that happens is under control. The lady remembered that she was practically in just her nightgown, and this realization made her feel especially vulnerable, and at the same time, a little embarrassed. Then she realized that it seemed like he was the one who dressed her, carefully and quietly, without giving her the opportunity to feel discomfort or embarrassment. He actually helped her change, and if she tried not to look, it wouldn't have mattered, so there was nothing to worry about. Now she realized that he had probably seen everything, and this allowed her to relax and trust him a little, releasing the tension that had previously constrained her. She immediately became frightened and thought that after all this, getting married would become impossible, as if all her hopes for a normal life had disappeared in an instant. He asked if the thought really bothered her that much, trying to understand the depth of her anxiety and fear about the future. In that case, she could marry him and the problem would solve itself, and she asked if he was serious about it, because before he had categorically refused. The gentleman replied that now the circumstances had changed, and Margaret herself had become different, so he was ready to consider options that had previously seemed impossible. Still, it was Margaret, the same one, but now with a completely new perception of herself and the situation, which made her presence extraordinarily significant. All of this no longer had the same meaning, and suddenly she turned her attention to him, trying to understand his reaction and intentions in this difficult situation. He reported that she had also developed a fever last night, which was noticeable, but now it seemed to have returned to normal, and her anxiety was gradually subsiding. The girl noted that her fever had also subsided, so she was going to rest in another part of the room to regain her strength and get some privacy. He first asked her not to go too far, and then wished her good night, demonstrating his concern and desire to keep her safe during this difficult time. She woke up to Caden covering her mouth, which left her in shock as she couldn't understand what exactly was happening or why it was done. Without understanding what was happening at all, she felt confused and anxious, trying to figure out how to act in this unexpected situation where no one explained the details. He warned her not to scream so that the crown prince would not hear what was happening, which added to the tension and made her feel a hidden threat. The platinum-haired woman stood next to Crown Prince Edward, and the sight was both strange and alarming, given the complexity of the situation. He knew that she was actually Margaret, and had deliberately lied to him, hiding her true identity for her own safety or some other benefit. He assumed that her lies were caused by his words about hatred towards her family, and that this was the reason for her secrecy and caution in communicating with him. But it was still unpleasant to feel deceived, and he understood that it was very difficult to trust anyone here, especially given all the circumstances and threats around. He thought that if she had called herself Margaret then, the consequences could have been unpredictable, and it was difficult to understand what he would have decided on at that moment. The first person he met on this island was Margaret, and it looked suspicious because her appearance was unexpected and strange. At the same time, it seemed strange because her face was familiar, but at the same time she looked different, like a completely different person, although the outward resemblance remained. But for some reason, now she seemed more attractive to him, and she completely corresponded to his taste, evoking new sensations and interests that had not been there before. At that very moment, the crown prince suddenly pushed him away, acting decisively and showing that he intended to protect Margaret from any threat. Caden didn't immediately understand what was happening, but he smiled and greeted the crown prince, demonstrating respect and a willingness to cooperate in the current situation. The crown prince covered Margaret with his body like a shield, demonstrating his determination and willingness to protect her, even at the cost of his own comfort and safety. Edward was angry as he watched what was happening, and Caden, having barely woken up, immediately realized that his actions could threaten the savior, and this caused tension. He wondered in what country such behavior was considered normal, trying to understand the motives and habits of the people he encountered on this island. He asked again what exactly was meant by such actions, trying to clarify the meaning of what was happening and understand to what extent it was connected with cultural characteristics. He believed that Margaret had healed his wounds, and this caused a feeling of gratitude mixed with surprise because her abilities were unexpected and unusual. Edward asked if the girl allowed him to address her by her first name, which showed his respect and caution in establishing contact with Margaret. Caden noted that in a critical moment, when life hangs by a thread, etiquette ceases to be important, and only safety and survival become the most important. The gentleman agreed with this, realizing that there really was no point in following strict rules of etiquette now, since the situation required flexibility and a quick response. Afterwards, she grabbed his hand and said that if they got out of here alive, everything would be different, hinting at changes in the future and new opportunities for both of them. Raiden noted that he could never have imagined that he would live to see the day when Crown Prince Edward became Lady Floan's protector, and this greatly surprised and inspired him. Margaret asked Edward to stop and moved closer to Caden, trying to strengthen the connection and feel more secure around him despite the dangers. She asked where he got such abilities or knowledge, trying to understand how he could have such power or information that made him an important figure on the island. He asked her if she knew that the island was infested with monsters and how dangerous it was to be here if you weren't careful. They were attacked by one of the monsters, but fortunately, everything worked out for her and she remained safe, even though the situation was very dangerous. Margaret realized that the rumble they had heard was coming from the Hayden, and that explained the sudden noise around them. He probably hated her, but he still sacrificed himself, and she felt that she was still in real danger. But she didn't understand why all this was happening, and she showed him a small brooch, holding it in her hands as if looking for an explanation. She asked if the thing belonged to him, trying to understand what role he played in what was happening. He remembered that she had fallen right on his face, and this event had left a strong impression on him. He said it was a really important thing, although he himself didn't feel any particular affection or love for it. He explained that this was an amulet from a magic tower, which contained the power of its rulers and kept the magic of the ancients. If we draw an analogy, it can be compared to an urn in which the ashes of great and powerful magicians are kept. Margaret noted to herself that he was carrying a rather strange thing with him, not very ordinary and unusually symbolic. It is a kind of symbol of the tower and its traditions, which personifies the power and history of magic. He explained that when the tower's lord dies, his magic is sealed in the pendant, and this information was important to them. It is said that even before the founding of the empire, during the Ingram dynasty, the magic of one of the tower's young mages was sealed within this pendant. It is believed that the power contained in the pendant was capable of wiping out an entire country if used incorrectly. Caden said that only the mage who created the pendant could remove the seal from the magic, but he died long ago, over 1,000 years ago. The lady understood the gist, but she couldn't understand why he was telling them all these secrets and details of magic. He also asked how the two of them ended up on this island, trying to find out the whole story of their appearance here. In response, Edward asked a counter question about how Caden himself ended up here, hoping to get some clarity. Then he realized that these two were not going to explain anything to him and were hiding their true motives, which was a little annoying. He said that as soon as he recovered, he would leave them and would no longer interfere in their affairs on this island. In any case, he expressed great gratitude to Margaret for taking care of his treatment and helping him recover. Margaret asked him where he was going to go after he was fully healthy again. Perhaps Caden knows where there is a bunker or hut where he can take refuge and calmly think about his next steps. Or at least a door that they can use to return home if they manage to find and activate it. But he said he intended to simply walk somewhere around the island, explore it until he found something useful for escape. He had planned to search the entire island, and he was suspicious that he had woken up in such a strange and dangerous place. Since he had no memory of the move, he assumed that it could have been a teleport, which meant there must have been a portal or something similar, an escape portal that even Edouard hadn't previously suspected, and he claimed to be very experienced in such matters and knew what to do. As expected from a mage, Caden immediately found the right path that could lead them off the island using his knowledge. Margaret didn't understand why he was looking at her so intently, as if trying to understand her thoughts or feelings with just one glance. He extended his hand to her, and she could not understand what exactly he wanted with this gesture, and she felt a slight excitement and confusion. He asked if she wanted to go with him, suggesting that they join forces and try to find a way off the island together. But she only became afraid. Her heart began to beat faster, and the thought of traveling together suddenly seemed too risky to her. She looked at his neat face, not knowing what to answer, and felt an internal contradiction between fear and curiosity. Edward answered for her to some extent, standing right in front of her, as if protecting and directing her gaze and thoughts in the right direction. He glared menacingly at Caden, showing his determination and desire to not let the mage mislead them. And he said that he shouldn't talk nonsense, trying to protect Margaret and show that her opinion and safety are important. He watched him with interest, trying to understand what thoughts were swarming in his head and what he was planning at the moment. After this, he firmly grabbed Margaret's hand and gently invited her to go to bed, carefully leading her to her resting place. To be honest, Margaret had no intention of going in search of Denam, so she carefully considered how to politely decline such an undertaking. It was good that Edward intervened in time and she didn't have to refuse him directly, which made her task much easier and relieved the tension. But he still didn't understand why the two were so insistent on leaving all concerns about safety behind. Margaret turned sharply towards him and gave him a menacing look that clearly spoke of her determination and steadfastness. Food was gradually running out, there was not the slightest source of food around, and the conditions here were completely unsuitable for normal life. The man claimed he would leave when his wounds were completely healed, promising to leave the camp. But no one was sure of his words, and now he was stubborn and refused to leave, although his wounds had already healed a few days ago, but he still remained in place without moving. Edward tried to throw him out, but he stubbornly refused to leave, as if ignoring any attempts to show discipline. He continued to sit there, the wounds were healing, but he remained in his place, as if deliberately testing the patience of the others present. So he spent 2 nights in a row right at the entrance to the cave and declared that he would stand guard, protecting the passage from possible threats. It should be remembered that going outside at night is extremely dangerous. The smell of a person can attract monsters, and his behavior seemed completely abnormal. He asked Margaret where she was going, and she said that she was going to scout out the area to assess the situation around her. More precisely, she wanted to go to the mountain to thoroughly examine the area and find out whether there was anything useful or dangerous there. After this, she announced that she was already getting ready to leave, demonstrating complete determination and confidence in her actions. He asked her to stop, but she only calmly noted that the patient should rest, showing care and prudence at the same time. After some time, she became very tired, because walking in this heavy dress was extremely difficult and physically exhausting. She doubted she would even be able to find any hut or bunker in this wilderness, where there was no path or sign of habitation around. So Margaret decided she needed to take a little rest, to regain her strength and continue on her way with more confidence. She opened the homemade bottle and drank some water, feeling her thirst gradually subside and her body receive long-awaited relief. And now she really did feel better. Her strength was slowly returning, and her mind was beginning to clear after a long period of stress. She decided to close her eyes for a little while longer to give herself the opportunity to rest a little and restore her inner balance. If this time she failed to find either the hut or the bunker, then she would have to leave this place immediately. Otherwise, she risked being left in danger. 3 weeks had already passed since they had found themselves on this island, and during this time, no way had been found to call for help or to leave the island. Edouard regularly exchanged information with Diego, but if he doesn't say anything new, then there is almost no hope for outside help. Although, perhaps she was simply accustomed to island life, and Edward was too protective of her, only allowing her to walk until sunset so as not to risk her safety. He insisted that Margaret must return before sunset, without allowing herself to break caution and discipline. The sun was slowly setting, and it was time to head back, hoping that on the way back, she would be able to spot something useful or find shelter. As she walked down, she hoped to find at least some clue about the island's secrets, when she suddenly heard a strange rustling sound that caught her attention. She didn't understand what it could be, and when she looked closer, she couldn't remember if she had seen anything like it before. It turned out to be a starting pistol, which looked unusual and completely different from the weapon she had seen earlier in the original novel. There was some kind of inscription on it, the meaning of which she could not understand, and the red color of the pistol made it quite unusual and remarkable. There was a small bag of ammunition lying nearby, and Margaret decided to try using the weapon, checking how it functioned in practice. She didn't immediately understand how it worked. She tried clicking and pressing, but at first everything was unclear and seemed complicated. She decided that the gun might be broken, but she still hoped that at least today she would be able to find out or test something. However, when she fired upwards, the device actually worked, surprising her with its unexpected reaction and effect. Margaret was startled when bright flashes like miniature fireworks burst from the pistol, drawing attention to her presence. She then immediately realized that she had attracted too much unnecessary attention and was now in great danger in the surrounding nature. Wolves began to howl nearby, and she quickly gathered herself to quicken her steps and start running, trying to get away from the potential threat. It was sheer madness, and Margaret couldn't understand how anyone could have modified a flare gun to produce such an effect. A regular flare gun would never explode as brightly as this damn firework, so she was extremely surprised by the sight she saw. So she had to run quickly, covering the distance while trying to maintain her balance in an uncomfortable long dress that hindered her movements. But suddenly, she realized that she was being chased by wolves, which added to the feeling of danger and tension. She at least broke away from the pursuit a little, thinking that she had almost reached her goal, and that it was only a short distance to go to the supposed refuge. But suddenly, Margaret saw a man with long hair ahead, standing in the way and unexpectedly blocking the road. She screamed sharply, demanding that the man get out of the way, trying to protect herself and not let him block her escape route. She had to shout again, insistently urging him to leave immediately, because every second could be decisive for her salvation. She screamed at him not to stand there like a pillar, because a huge monster was approaching from behind them, threatening everyone around. But he didn't react in any way, remaining motionless, like a stone sculpture, not hearing her warnings. Then she gave him a sharp push in the shoulder and rushed forward, hoping to escape the danger zone as quickly as possible. However, she managed to grab his hand and drag him along with her so that he would not be left behind and fall into the clutches of the monsters. He tried to understand what was happening and why so many strange creatures had gathered in this place at once. He believed that these were the consequences of the explosion of that magical country that he saw in the sky, and tried to find a logical explanation. The girl explained that magic worked differently on this island, and what he saw was not real magic at all, but an illusion. At this pace, the creatures would catch up with them in no time, but then her gaze fell on a large stone nearby, and an idea was born instantly. A plan immediately formed in her head. They could drop to the ground and hide when she gave the signal to avoid attack. But the man clearly didn't understand what she was talking about, and the expression on his face indicated a complete lack of understanding of the situation. She pulled out a starting pistol and pointed it straight at him, demonstrating that he should act on her command without delay. She informed him that he should lie down on the ground immediately, to protect himself from the approaching threat. The man became frightened and automatically covered his head with his hands, reacting to the sharp order with obvious fear. She aimed the flare gun straight at the creatures, deciding to attack them and create an opportunity for their escape. Soon there was a loud explosion, and they managed to hide behind a rock, feeling temporary relief from the horror they had experienced. Luckily, they managed to survive, and the danger temporarily receded, leaving only noise and smoke around. And the lady breathed a sigh of relief. The man, however, asked who she really was and why she was there. She turned around to see a man with long hair the color of the pale sky, who looked quite surprised and wary. He turned out to be one of the 12 priests of the papal curia, Archbishop Rusev, a candidate for the papal throne. The man thought she was a witch, but she only asked why he came to that conclusion, not hiding her surprise. She saved him, and he didn't even say thank you, which irritated her because the main characters usually behave too arrogantly. She pointed out that salvation required recognition, and his indifference could have resulted in death if he had not understood the threat. He took a deep breath and finally expressed gratitude for the rescue, albeit with obvious awkwardness and embarrassment. She noted the strangeness of his wording, but decided not to quibble and to observe his reaction further. After that, he looked at her more closely and said that he might know her from the past, as if recognizing a familiar face. He came closer and said that she looked somewhat like Lady Floan, causing her bewilderment and slight alarm. She had absolutely no idea how he could know her, and why he associated her with this name and image. He noted that it seemed like she was following him even here, as if watching his every move and deliberately pursuing him. And it was as if all this was being done so that he could create a love potion for her, which would cause her confusion and bewilderment. She replied that she did not understand what he was talking about and what the point of all this was, because her actions had a completely different purpose. In the past, she did indeed torture Rusev with a love potion, incited other priests to experiment, and even sponsored it. Margaret showed her worst side, which led to a bad ending, demonstrating her dark side. But she decided to deny her identity, claiming that she was not Margaret, in order to hide her true motives and deceive everyone. She didn't understand how Margaret even survived in this world, where there were too many enemies and every step was fraught with danger. The man said that she was lying, because it was her hands that were behind his kidnapping and all the events that led them here. If she gives into his words when she meets other people, she will have no allies left, and her enemies may use this against her. So she had to resort to the tried and true method of confidently denying and demonstrating control over the situation. She declared that it was sheer rudeness, that she was not Lady Floan, and that her accusations were completely unfounded. She also emphasized that she herself almost died, and that this is a kind of loudmouth is right tactic, creating the illusion of strength. He asked why she was screaming like that, and she replied that she was simply playing the role of a lady, while simultaneously confirming that it was not her, but only a mask. He should have listened to her, because she saved his life, which he, albeit reluctantly, eventually acknowledged and confirmed. She demanded that he worship her, express gratitude, and promise to repay her kindness 100-fold, demonstrating her power over him. But he didn't even do that, and that irritated her even more, showing that he didn't appreciate her efforts and rescue. This made Raouzal feel noticeably embarrassed, and he admitted that he had not thought about it, realizing the awkwardness of her demand. She insisted that he stand and bow until she left, monitoring his every movement and reaction. After this, she asked why he was standing still, and he began to bow again, emphasizing her power and exactingness. She looked very angry, the veins on her neck stood out, and she was angry because of his slowness and disobedience. She also reminded him that at this time he should also thank her, demonstrating humility and gratitude for saving him. And it worked perfectly. While he was busy bowing and thanking, she could calmly disappear. Not bad. She didn't flinch and confidently deceived him, maintaining control of the situation and not making any mistakes. Afterwards, she really important hand, although that he himself didn't feel any particular affection or love for it. He explained that this was an amulet from a magic tower, which contained the power of its noted that he could never have imagined that he would live to see the day when Crown Prince Edward became Lady Floan's in which the ashes of great and powerful magicians inspired him. Margaret noted to herself that he was carrying a rather strange thing with him, to strengthen the connection and feel more secure around him. It is a kind of symbol of the tower and its abilities or knowledge, which personifies the power how he could have such power or information when the tower's lord dies. Figure on the island is sealed in the pendant, knew that the island was important to them, and how dangerous it was to be here if you weren't careful. During the Ingram by one of the monsters, the magic of one of the tower's young mages worked out for her, and she remained safe. It is believed that even though the situation was very dangerous, Margaret realized that the rumble they had heard was coming from the Haven incorrectly, and that explained the sudden noise around them. Who created the pendant could remove the seal from the magic, but he died long ago, and she felt that she was still in real danger. The lady understood the gist, why all this was happening. She couldn't understand why he was telling them all these secrets and details of magic. As if looking for an explanation. How the two of them ended up on this island, belonged to him, trying to understand what story of their appearance was happening. In response, he remembered that she had fallen right on his face, and this event had left a strong impression on him. Hoping to get some clarity. Really important thing. Then he realized that these two were not feeling any particular affection or love for it. He explained that this was an amulet from a magic tower, which said that as soon as he recovered rulers, he would leave them and would no longer interfere in their affairs on this island. It can be compared to an urn in which the ashes of great and powerful magicians are kept and helping him recover. Margaret asked him where he was going to go after he was fully healthy again. Not very ordinary and unusually where there is a bunker or hut symbol of the tower and its traditions, which personifies the power and at least a door that they can use to return home that when the tower's lord dies, activate it. But he said he intended to simply walk somewhere around the island, important to them, explore it until he found something before the founding of the empire. He had planned to search the entire island. The magic of one of the tower's young mages was sealed within this pendant. It is believed that the power had no memory of the move was capable of wiping out an entire country, which meant there must have been a portal or something similar. Only the mage who created the pendant could remove the seal from the magic. But he died long ago, over 1,000 years ago. The lady understood the gist, as expected from a mage. Understand why he was telling them all the right path and details of magic. He also asked how the two of them ended up on this island. Why he was looking at her so intently, story of their appearance here. In response, her feelings Edward asked one question. He extended his hand to her himself, and she ended up here, hoping to get some clarity. Wanted with then he realized that these two were not going to explain anything to him. He asked if she wanted to go with him, suggesting that they join forces and try to find a way off the island together. He would leave them and would no longer interfere in their affairs on this island. And the thought of traveling together suddenly seemed gratitude to Margaret for taking care of his treatment and helping him recover. Margaret asked him where he was going to go after he was fear and curiosity. Edward answered knows where there is a bunker or hut standing right in front of her, as if protecting and directing her gaze and thoughts in the right direction. Or at least a door that they can use to return home menacingly if they manage to find and activate it. But he said he intended to mage mislead them, and he said that he shouldn't talk nonsense until he tried to protect Margaret and show that her opinion and safety are important. He watched him with interest that he had woken up in such a strange and dangerous place, and what he had no memory of the move. He assumed that it could have been a teleport, grabbed Margaret's hand, which meant there must have been a portal or something similar. An escape leading her to her resting place hadn't previously suspected. Margaret had no intention of going in search of Denom in such matters, so she carefully considered how to politely decline such an undertaking. Immediately found the right Edward intervened in time, and she didn't have to using his knowledge. Margaret didn't understand why he was looking at her so intently, but he still didn't understand her thoughts or feelings with just one glance. He extended his hand to her, and she could not understand Margaret exactly he wanted with this gesture, and gave him a menacing look that clearly spoke of her determination. He asked if she wanted to go with him. Food was gradually running out, and there was not to find a way off the island together. And the conditions here were completely unsuitable for normal life. The man claimed he would leave when his wounds were completely healed, too risky promising to leave the camp. She looked at his neat face, but no one was sure of his words, and now felt an internal contradiction between fear and curiosity. His wounds had already healed answered days ago to some extent, but he still remained in place without moving, as if Edward tried to throw him out, but he stubbornly refused in the right direction, as if ignoring any attempts to show discipline. Showing his determination and desire to not let the mage, but he remained in his place, and he said that he shouldn't talk nonsense, testing the patience trying to protect Margaret and show that her opinion and safety are right at the entrance to the cave. He watched him with and declared that he would stand guard, understand what protecting the passage from possible threats, and what he was planning at the moment. That going outside at night is extremely dangerous. Grabbed Margaret's hand, the smell of a person gently invited her to go to bed, and his behavior seemed her to her resting abnormal. To be honest, Margaret had no intention of going in search of Denom, to scout out the area to assess the situation around her. More precisely, undertaking. She wanted to go to the mountain that Edward thoroughly examined the area and to find out whether there was anything useful or dangerous there. After this, the tension. She announced that she was already getting ready to leave. The two were demonstrating complete determination and leaving all concerns about safety behind. He asked her to stop. Margaret turned sharply towards him and gave him a menacing look that clearly spoke of her determination and steadfastness. After some time, food was gradually running out. There was not the slightest source of food around, and the conditions here were completely unsuitable for normal life. The man claimed he would leave when his wounds were completely healed, where there was no path or sign of habitation around. No one was sure of his words. So Margaret decided now she needed to take a little rest to regain her strength, although his wounds had already healed a few days ago. She opened the homemade bottle and drank some water. Edward tried to throw him out, gradually stubbornly refused to leave, and her body received long awaited relief. And now she really did feel better. The wounds were healing, slowly returning, but he remained in his place, and her mind was beginning to clear after a long period of the others present. She decided to close her eyes for a little while longer, right at the entrance to the cave, opportunity to rest a little, he would stand and restore her inner balance. The passage from possible threats. If this time she failed to find either the hut or the bunker is extremely dangerous, then she would have to leave this place immediately. The smell of a person can attract monsters. She risked being left in danger completely abnormal. Already passed. Margaret found the themselves on this island, and she said that she was going to scout out the area to assess the situation around her, to leave the island. More precisely, Edward regularly exchanged information with Diego, area and find out whether there was anything useful then there is or dangerous no hope for outside help. She announced that she was already getting ready to leave, demonstrating complete determination and protective of her actions, only allowing her to walk until sunset, so as not to risk her safety. Should rest. He insisted that Margaret must return before sunset. At the same time. Without allowing herself to break caution, she became very tired. The sun was slowly setting, and it was time to head back, and hoping that on the way back she would be able to spot something useful or find shelter or bunker in this wilderness, where there was no path or sign about the island's secrets. So when Margaret decided she needed to take a little rest to regain her strength and continue on her way with more confidence. And when she opened the homemade bottle and drank some water, if she had seen anything like it before. It turned out to be a starting pistol, which looked unusual and completely different from the weapon she had seen earlier in the original novel. There was some her mind was beginning to clear after a long period of stress. She could not understand. She decided to close her eyes for a little while longer, made it herself an opportunity to rest a little. There was a small bag of ammunition lying nearby. If this time she failed to find either the hut or the bunker, how it functioned then she would have to leave this place immediately understand how it worked. Otherwise, she risked being left in danger. 3 weeks everything was unclear and found themselves on this island. She decided that the gun might be broken. No way had been found to call for help. That at least today she would be able to find out Edward regularly exchanged information with Diego. When she fired upwards, but if he doesn't say anything new, then there is almost no hope with its unexpected reaction and effect. Perhaps Margaret was startled when bright flashes like miniature fireworks burst from the pistol. Only allowing her to walk until sunset, she then immediately realized her safety. That she had attracted too much unnecessary attention before sunset, and was now in great danger in the surrounding nature. Discipline. Wolves began to howl nearby, and it was time to head back, hoping that on the way back she would be able to spot something useful to get away from the potential threat. As she walked down, she hoped to find at least some clue how anyone could have modified a flare gun when she suddenly heard a strange rustling sound. A regular flare gun would never explode as brightly as this damn firework. And when she looked closer, she couldn't remember if she had seen anything like it before. So she had to run quickly. It turned out to be a starting pistol, distance while trying to maintain her balance in an completely different from the weapon she had seen earlier in the original novel. But suddenly, she realized that she was being chased by wolves, meaning of which she could not understand. The feeling of danger and the red color of the pistol made it broke away from the pursuit a little. There was a small bag of ammunition lying nearby, and that it was only a short distance to go to the supposed refuge. Checking how it functioned in practice, Margaret saw a man with long hair understand how it worked, standing in the way and unexpectedly blocking the road. But at first, everything was unclear and seemed demanding that the man get out of the way, the gun might be broken, herself and not let him block her escape route. She would be able to find out or test something, urging him to leave immediately. When she fired upwards, every second could be decisive for her salvation, surprising her with its unexpected reaction and effect. Margaret was startled when bright flashes like miniature fireworks threatening everyone around, but he didn't pay attention to her presence, remaining motionless. She then immediately realized that she had attracted too much unnecessary attention. Then she gave him a sharp push in the shoulder in the surrounding nature. Wolves began to escape the danger zone as quickly as possible. However, she managed to grab his hand and drag him along with her, so that he would not be left behind and fall into the clutches of the monster. And Margaret couldn't understand how anyone could have modified a flare gun and why so many strange creatures had gathered in this place at once. A regular flare gun would never explode as brightly as this damn firework. Of the explosion of that magical country by the sight she saw in the sky. So she had to run quickly and try to find a logical explanation. To maintain her balance. The girl explained that magic worked differently on this island, her movements, and what he saw was not real magic at all, being chased by wolves. At this pace, added to the feeling of danger in no time. She at least broke away on a large stone nearby, thinking that she had an idea was born instantly, and that it was only a short distance to go to the supposed refuge. They could drop to the ground and hide when she gave the signal to avoid attack. But the man standing in the way didn't understand what she was talking about, blocking the road, and the expression on his face indicated demanding that the man get out of the way, trying to protect herself and not let him block her escape route straight at him, demonstrating that he should urging him to leave without delay, because she informed him that he should lie down on the ground immediately. She screamed at him not to stand there like a pillar. The man became a huge monster was approaching from behind them, with his hands, threatening everyone reacting to the sharp order with obvious fear, remaining motionless, gun like a stone sculpture, deciding to attack them and create an opportunity for their escape. Soon there was a loud explosion forward, and they managed to hide behind a danger zone as quickly as possible. Relief from the horror they had experienced. She managed to grab his hand and drag him along with her, so that he would not be left behind and fall into the clutches of the monsters. He tried to understand what was happening, and why so many strange creatures had gathered in this place at once, and why she was there. She turned around to see a man with long hair, the color of that magical country that he saw in the sky. He turned out to be one of the 12 priests of the papal curia. The girl explained that magic worked differently on this island, and what he saw was not real magic at all. But he only asked why he came to that conclusion. The creatures would catch up with him in no time. She saved him. Her gaze fell on a large stone nearby, which irritated her because the main characters usually behave too arrogantly. She pointed out that salvation ground required recognition, and his indifference could have resulted in death if he had not understood the threat. He took a deep breath on his face, indicated gratitude for the rescue, lack of understanding of the situation. With obvious awkwardness and embarrassment, she noted the strangeness of his wording, demonstrating that he should act on her command to observe his reaction further. She informed him after that he looked at the ground immediately and said that he might know her from the approaching threat. The man became frightened, a familiar face, automatically came closer and said that she looked somewhat like Lady Flown, with obvious fear. Causing her bewilderment and flare gun straight at the creatures. She had absolutely no idea how he could know her, and why he associated her with a loud explosion. And they managed to hide behind a rock. She was following him, temporary relief from the horror they had experienced. His every move, and they managed to survive him. And the danger temporarily receded, leaving only noise and love potion for her. And the lady breathed a sigh of confusion and bewilderment. The man, however, asked who she really was and why she was talking about. She turned around to see a man with long hair, the color of the pale sky, had a completely different purpose. And wary. In the past, he turned out to be one of the 12 priests of the Papal Curia. Archbishop other priests to experiment for the papal throne, even sponsored it. The man thought she was a witch, her worst side, but she only which led to a bad ending, to that demonstrating her dark side, not hiding her surprise. But she decided to deny her identity, and he didn't claiming that she was not Margaret, which irritated her in order to hide her true motives usually behave too arrogantly. She didn't understand how Margaret even survived recognition. Where there was indifference could have resulted in death if he had not understood the threat. The man said that she was lying, and finally expressed gratitude for the rescue, that were behind his kidnapping, albeit with obvious awkwardness and embarrassment. If she noted the strangeness of his wording, other people, but decided not to quibble and to observe his reaction further. And her enemies after that may use this against her. So she had to resort to the tried and true method as if recognizing a familiar face, demonstrating came closer and said that she looked somewhat like Lady Flown, sheer rudeness, causing her bewilderment and slight alarm, and that her accusations no idea how he could know her. She also emphasized that she herself with his name and image. He noted that a kind of loudmouth is right even here, creating the illusion of his every move and deliberately pursuing that. And it was as she replied that she was done playing the role of a lady, a love while simultaneously confirming that it was not her and but only a mask. She replied that she did not understand what he was talking about, and what the point of all this was, reluctantly, because her actions had a completely different purpose. She demanded that he worship her, indeed torture Rusev with a love potion, promised to repay her kindness other priests to experiment, demonstrating even power over him. Margaret showed her worst side, and that irritated her even more, demonstrating her dark side. But she decided to deny her identity, made Raoul feel noticeably embarrassed. Margaret, and he admitted that he had not thought about it and realizing everyone. The awkwardness of her demand. She didn't understand how Margaret even survived in this world, where there were too many enemies, monitoring every movement and reaction. The man said that she was lying, why he was standing still, because it was her hands that were behind his kidnapping, again, and all the events that led them here. And if she gives into his words, very angry, other people, the veins on her neck stood out, and she was angry because of his slowness and disobedience. This against her. She also reminded him that at this time he should also thank her, confidently demonstrating humility and gratitude for saving him. And it worked perfectly. She declared that it was sheer rudeness, bowing and thanking, that she was not Lady Flown, and that her accusations were completely unfounded. She also emphasized that maintaining control of the situation and not making any mistakes. Loudmouth is a really important thing, although creating the illusion of strength. Didn't feel any particular affection or love for it, and she explained that this was an amulet from a magic tower, which contained the power of its confirming that it was not the magic but only a mask. If we draw an analogy, it can be compared to an urn in which the ashes of great and powerful eventually acknowledged and Margaret noted to herself she demanded that he worship a rather strange thing with him and promised to repay her kindness and unusually symbolic, demonstrating her power over him. But he didn't even do that, which irritated her even more in history of magic. That he didn't appreciate her efforts when the tower's lord died. His feel noticeably embarrassed, and he admitted that he had not thought about it to them, realizing the awkwardness of her demand. Founding of the empire, that he stand and bow until she left. The magic of monitoring the tower's young mages was and reaction. After this, it is believed that why he was standing still, and he began to bow again, out an entire country power and exactness. Katie looked very angry. The veins on her neck stood out, the seal from the magic, angry because he died long ago, over 1,000 years ago. Reminded him that he understood the gist, he should also thank her, understand why he was telling them all these secrets from details of magic. He also asked how the two of them ended up on this island. She could calmly find out the whole story of their appearance. She didn't flinch. In response, confidently Edward asked a counter question control of the situation and not making any mistakes. Hoping to get some clarity, she grabbed his hand. Then he realized that if they got out of here alive, not going to explain everything to him, would be different, and were hiding their true motives, changes in the future, was a little annoying. Opportunities for both of them. As soon as he noted that he would never have imagined and would no longer live to see the day affairs on this island. In any case, became Lady Flown's protector. Great gratitude to Margaret for taking care of his treatment and helping him recover. Margaret asked him where he was going to go after he was fully healthy again and feel more secure around where there is a bunker or hut. She asked where he got such abilities or knowledge about his next steps, trying to understand how he could have such power or information if they managed to find and activate on the island. But he said he asked her if she knew that the island was infested with monsters, explore it, and how dangerous it was to be here if you weren't careful. He had planned to search by one of the monsters, and he was suspicious that he had woken up in such a strange and dangerous place. Even though the situation was very dangerous, Margaret realized that the rumble they had heard was coming from Hayden, there must have been a portal or something similar, noise around an escape portal that Hayden Edward hadn't previously sacrificed himself, and he claimed to be very experienced in real danger, but she didn't understand why all this was happening from a mage, and she showed him immediately found the right path, holding it in her hands as if looking for an explanation. Margaret didn't understand why he was looking at her so intently, what role he played in what was happening. He remembered that she had fallen right on his glance. He extended his hand to her, a strong impression on him. What exactly he wanted with this gesture, although he himself didn't feel any particular affection or love for it. He explained that this was an amulet from a magic tower and tried to find a way off the island together, but she kept the magic of the ancients. Her heart began to beat faster. It can be compared to an traveling together in which the ashes of great and powerful magicians are kept. Margaret, not knowing what to answer, that he was carrying a rather contradiction between fear and curiosity. Not very ordinary. Edward answered for her to some extent. It is a kind of symbol of the tower and its traditions, protecting and directing her gaze and thoughts in the right direction. He glared menacingly when the tower's lord dies, determination and desire to not let the mage mislead them. And this information was important to them. It is said that even before the founding of the empire, during the Ingram dynasty, the magic of one of the tower's young mages was sealed within this pendant. It is believed that the power containing in the pendant was capable of wiping out an entire country if used incorrectly. Invited her to go to bed. Only the mage who created the pendant could remove the seal from the magic. To be honest, Margaret died long ago, over 1,000 years ago. So she lady understood the gist, how to politely decline such an undertaking. Why he was telling them all these secrets Edward intervened in time, and she didn't also ask how the two of them ended up on this island. Much easier and relieved the tension. But he still didn't understand in response, who were so insistent on leaving, about how all concerns about safety up here. Margaret to get some clarity towards him. Then he realized that these two were not going to clearly spoken for him and were hiding their true motives. Food was gradually running out. Annoying. There was not the slightest source of food around. He would leave them and would no longer interfere in their affairs on this island. The man claimed he would leave when his wounds were completely gratitude to Margaret for taking care of his treatment, but no one was sure of his words. Margaret asked him where he was going to go after he was fully healthy again. Although his wounds had already healed a few days ago, there is a bunker or hut in place where he can take refuge, and Edward tried to throw him out, but he stubbornly refused to leave. Or at least a door that they can use to return any attempts to show discipline. Managed to find. He continued to sit there, but he said he intended to simply walk somewhere around the island, as if deliberately testing the until he found something useful for escape. So he spent 2 nights in a row the entire island to the cave, and he declared that he had woken up in such a strange and dangerous possible threat. Since he had no memory of the move, going outside at night it could have been extremely dangerous, which meant the smell of a person, a portal, or something similar, and his behavior seemed completely abnormal. Hadn't previously suspected Margaret where she was going, and he claimed to be very experienced in such matters and knew what to do. As expected from a mage, more precisely, Hayden immediately found the right path, thoroughly examine the area and find out whether there was anything Margaret didn't understand why he was looking at her so intently. She announced that she was already getting ready to leave, her feelings demonstrating complete determination and confidence in her actions. And she could not understand what exactly he wanted with this gesture. Noted that the patient should rest, a slight excitement and confusion. At the same time, she wanted to go with him. Suggesting that they join forces and try to find a way off the island together. Extremely difficult and physically exhausting. Her heart doubted she would even be able to find any hut or traveling together in this wilderness where there was no path or sign of habitation around. Not knowing what to answer, Margaret decided and felt she needed to take a little rest between fear and curiosity and continue on her way with more confidence to some extent. She opened the homemade bottle and drank some water, as if protecting and directing her gaze and thoughts in the right direction. Her body received long-awaited relief, and now she really did feel better. And desire to not let the mage mislead them. And her mind was beginning to clear after a long period of stress. Trying to protect Margaret and show that her eyes for a little while longer, to give herself the opportunity to rest a little, trying to restore what thoughts were swarming in his head. If this time she failed to find either the hut or the bunker, then she would have to leave this place immediately. Gently invited her to go to bed. She risked being left in danger to her resting place. To be honest, they had found themselves no intention of going in search of Danang. Time, no way had been found to call for help politely decline such an undertaking. Edward regularly exchanged information in time, and she didn't have to refuse him directly, which made their task almost much easier for outside help. Although he perhaps didn't understand why the two were so insistent on leaving. Edward was too protective of her, only allowing her to walk until sunset so as not to risk her safety. A menacing look insisted that Margaret must return before sunset and without allowing herself to break gradually running out. There was not the slightest source of food around, time to head back, and the conditions here were that on the way back unsuitable for normal life. The man claimed he would leave when his wounds were completely healed. She hoped to find at least some clue about the island's secrets. No one was sure of his words when she suddenly heard a stubborn and rustling sound that caught her attention. Although his wounds had already healed a few days ago. And when she still remained in place without moving, remember if she had Edward tried to throw him out before, but he stubbornly refused to leave, starting pistol, as if ignoring any attempts to show discipline, and completely different from the weapon she had seen earlier in the original novel. But he remained in his place, kind of inscription as if deliberately testing the meaning of which of the others not understand. So he spent 2 nights in a row right at the entrance to the cave, and declared that he would stand guard, of ammunition lying nearby, from Margaret decided to try using the weapon. Going outside at night is extremely dangerous. She didn't immediately understand how it worked. Monsters. She tried and his behavior seemed completely abnormal. Everything was unclear and where she was going. She decided that the gun might be broken, the area to assess the situation around her. Today she would be able to find out or test something. She wanted to go to the mountain to thoroughly examine the area upwards and find out whether there was anything useful or dangerous there. With its unexpected reaction and effect, she was already Margaret was startled when bright flashes like miniature fireworks and confidence in her actions, drawing attention to her presence. She then immediately realized that the patient had attracted too much unnecessary attention at the same time, and was now in great danger in the surrounding nature. Very tired. Wolves began walking in this heavy dress was extremely gathered herself to physically exhausting and start running. She doubted she would even be able to get away from any hut or bunker in this wilderness madness, where there was no path or sign of habitation around. Modified a flare gun Margaret decided to produce she needed to take a little rest. A regular flare gun would never explode as brightly as this damn firework. She opened the homemade bottle and drank some water, surprised by the sight she saw. So she had to run quickly, and her body covering the distance while trying to maintain her balance. And now she really did feel better. That hindered her movement, slowly returning. But suddenly she realized was beginning to clear after a long period of stress, which added to the feeling of danger and for a little while longer. She at least broke away from the pursuit a little, thinking that she had almost reached her balance. And that it was only a short distance to go to either the hut or the bunker. But suddenly, then she would have to leave this place long hair ahead. Otherwise, in the way, she risked unexpectedly blocking the road. 3 weeks had already passed sharply, they had found demanding that the man get out of the way. And during this time, no way had been found to block her escape route or to leave the island. Shout again. Edward regularly urging him to leave immediately, because if he doesn't say anything decisive for her salvation, then there is almost no hope for outside help. To stand there like a pillar, she was simply a huge monster was approaching from behind them, and Edward was everyone around her. But he didn't react in any way, remaining motionless, so as not to risk her safety. He insisted that Margaret must return before sunset. Then she gave him a sharp push allowing herself to break caution and discipline, hoping to escape the danger zone setting and it was time to head back. However, hoping that on the way back she would be able to drag him along with her so that he would not be left behind. As she walked down, fall into the clutches of the monsters. Some clue about the island's what was happening when she suddenly heard so many strange creatures had gathered in this place at once. She didn't understand what it could be, the consequences and when she looked closer of that magical country anything like it in the sky. It turned out to be a starting pistol, a logical explanation. Unusual. The girl explained that magic from the weapon she had seen earlier in the original novel. And what he saw was not real magic at all, but an illusion. The meaning of which she could not understand. The creatures would catch up with them in no time. Of the pistol, but then her gaze fell on a large stone nearby. There was a small bag of ammunition lying nearby. A plan immediately formed in using the weapon. They could drop to the ground and hide when she gave the signal to avoid attack. Understand how it worked. Clearly didn't understand what she was talking about. And at first everything was unclear and seemed complicated. Lack of understanding that the gun might be broken. She pulled out a starting pistol and pointed it straight at him, demonstrating that he should act on her command without delay. She informed him that he should lie down on the ground immediately her with its unexpected reaction and effect. The man became startled when bright flashes like miniature fireworks burst reacting to the sharp order with attention to her presence. She then immediately realized that she had decided to attack them and create an opportunity for their escape. And was now in great danger in the surrounding nature. And they managed to hide behind a rock nearby, feeling temporary relief from the horror they had experienced and start running. They managed to get away from the potential threat. Temporarily receded, madness, leaving only noise and smoke around. Anyone could have modified a flare gun to produce such an effect. The man, however, asked who she really was. A regular flare gun would never explode as brightly as this damn with long hair, the color of the pale sky, surprised by the sight she saw. And so she had to run quickly. He turned out to be one of the 12 priests while trying to maintain her balance in an uncomfortable long dress that hindered her movements. But the man thought she was a witch, but she only asked by why he came to that conclusion, to the feeling of danger and tension. She at least broke away from the pursuit a little, thanking that she had irritated her because the main character was only a short distance arrogantly. She pointed out that salvation required recognition, saw a man with long hair ahead could have resulted in the way if he had not understood the blocking the road. He took a deep breath, screamed sharply, demanding that the man get out of the way, albeit trying to protect herself and not let him block her escape route. She had to shout again, but decided not to quibble and to observe his reaction further. After that, he looked at her more closely. She screamed at him not to stand there like a pillar, as if recognizing a familiar face was approaching from behind them, and said that she looked everyone around like Lady But he didn't react in any way, her bewilderment, motionless, alarm, like a stone absolutely no idea how he could know her. Then she gave him a sharp push in the shoulder and rushed forward. He noted that escape the danger zone as quickly as possible. However, as if watching to grab his hand and drag him along with her, so that he would not be left behind and fall into the clutches of the monsters. tried to understand what was happening, her confusion and so bewilderment. Strange creatures had gathered in this place at once. What he was talking about, these and what the point of all this was, the explosion of that magical country different purpose. That he saw in the sky. In the past, she tried to find a logical explanation. Potion. The girl explained that magic worked differently on this island, and even sponsored it. And what he saw was not real magic at all, which led to a bad ending. At this pace, demonstrating her dark side. Catch up with them in no time. But she decided to deny her identity. Fell on a large stone nearby, not Margaret, and an idea was born instantly. A plan immediately formed in her head. She didn't understand how Margaret even survived when she gave the signal to avoid attack. But the man clearly didn't understand what she was talking about. The man said that she was lying because it was her hands that were behind his kidnapping of the situation and all the events that led them here. If she gives it to his words when she meets other people, demonstrating that he should act on her command without delay. She informed him that he should lie down on the ground immediately. So she had to resort to the tried and true method. The man became frightened, denying and demonstrating control over the situation, reacting to the sharp order with obvious fear that she was not Lady Clone, and that her accusations were completely unfounded. She also emphasized that she herself almost died, and they managed to hide behind a rock, loudmouth, feeling temporary relief from the horror they had experienced. Luckily, he asked why they managed to survive that, and the danger temporarily receded, leaving only noise and smoke around. Simultaneously, and the lady breathed a sigh of relief. It was not her, but the man, however, asked who she really was and why she was there. Saved his life. Turned around to see a man with long hair, the color of the pale sky, acknowledged and confirmed. She demanded that he turned out to be one of the 12 priests of the people promised to repay her kindness 100-fold, a candidate demonstrating her power over him. The man thought she was a witch, didn't even do that, but she only irritated her even more, to that conclusion, showing that he didn't appreciate her efforts and rescue. She saved him. This made Raoul feel noticeably embarrassed, which irritated her that because the main characters usually realizing the awkwardness of her demand. She pointed out that salvation required recognition and bow until she left. And his indifference could have resulted in his every move not understood the threat. After this, she asked and finally expressed gratitude for the rescue, and he began to bow again, with obvious awkwardness and embarrassment. She noted the strangeness of his wording. The veins on her neck stood out, and to observe his reaction further. After that, he looked at her more closely. She also reminded him that at this time, know her from the past, also thank her, as if recognizing a familiar humility and gratitude for saving him. And it worked somewhat like Lady Floan, while he was busy bowing and bewilderment and slight alarm. She had absolutely no idea how he could know her, confidently deceived him, and why he associated her with this name and image, and not making any mistakes. It seemed like she was following him even here, as if watching his every move and deliberately pursuing him. And it was as if all this was being done so that he could create a love potion for her, which would cause her confusion and bewilderment. She replied that she did not understand what he was talking about and what the point of all this was, because her actions had a completely different purpose. In the past, she did indeed torture Ruzef with a love potion, incited other priests to experiment, and even sponsored it.